Enter in the register this morning.
All right. So much
I
for
mean, you can call it to order.
Chris went to the restroom.
Yeah, he had to change, he had to move his car.
Recollection is Caldwell and Bill Dodd were kind of. Good morning, everyone. We're going to get started in a few minutes here. So if you can get your last cup of coffee and then make your way to a seat, please.
Hey, how are you?
Paul or Leon, can one of you try speaking?
You're so lucky to be back here.
Vice Leon, you were asking?
Leon,
Yes.
can you say, this is Leon Garcia, test, test?
This is Leon Garcia, test, test.
This is Paul Doring,
I
test,
think I
test.
hear you. Paul, can you try saying your name and test, test?
This is Paul Doring, test, test.
Okay,
And Kathy, this is Deanne Gillick. I can hear you guys too.
great, thank you. Deanne, you're coming through loud and clear. Thank you.
It's Leon Garcia again, test, test. Is that
There
working?
we go. Thank you.
A lot of background noise.
Yes, there is.
I think so.
Sorry.
Two, 4, 6, 3, 4.
Hopefully everyone has had a cup of coffee. So my name is Alfredo Pedrosa, Chair of the Napa Valley Transportation Authority. I want to welcome you all today. I want to thank the public for joining us today for a very special meeting. Retreat. We are in person. We ask that everyone to follow masking guidelines and mandates. So while you're here, we do require you to wear a mask. And again, we're going to have opportunity for public comment. So we're officially going to call this meeting to order. If we can please do the pledge of allegiance. And I'm going to ask Mary Dunbar to lead the pledge, please.
We are supposed to. Sorry about that.
Let's identify the orientation of the flag.
The United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
It feels a little odd to do in-person meetings, so we're doing a hybrid today. So we have some that are attending in person. We also have some board members that are attending virtually. So at this point, I want to remind you, do we have to roll the COVID announcement? Okay, thank you very much. So let's proceed with roll call.
Leon Garcia,
Here.
Mark Joseph,
Here.
Chris Canny,
Here, he had to step out.
thank you. Liz Alessio,
Present.
Scott Sedgley,
Present.
Alfredo Pedrosa,
Here.
Belia Ramos, here. Paul Doring,
Here.
Jeff Ellsworth. Jeff, I see you, so I'm gonna mark you here. John Dunbar.
Here.
Carrie Dorman. Here. And Doug Weir. Yeah, of course.
All right, thank you very much. Let's move on to the adoption of the agenda. Is there any changes to the Napa Valley Transportation Authority agenda? Seeing none from board members, so we have any member of the public that wishes to make any request on the adoption of the agenda for the authority? Seeing none, I will entertain a motion. First by Joseph.
Second.
Second by Alessio. Roll call vote, please.
Leon Garcia,
Yes.
Mark Joseph,
Yes.
Liz Alessio,
Aye.
Scott Sedgley,
Aye.
Alfredo Pedrosa,
Yes.
Belia Ramos, yes. Paul Doring,
Yes.
Jeff Ellsworth,
Yes.
Jerry Dorman, John Dunbar.
Yes.
Motion passes.
Thank you, Laura. Let's move on to public comment. This is how any member of the public address the authority on any item that's not on today's agenda. Any member of the public that wishes to provide public comment before the authority? Seeing none, do we have anyone virtually?
We do not.
All right, let's move on to item 6, chairpersons, board members, ABAG, NTC update. I'll turn to our ABAG representatives. Do we have an update from our ABAG representative, Supervisor Ramos or Mayor Garcia?
I'll go ahead and provide, an update. We had, administrative committee that's come together to, review our RENA appeals process, 28 jurisdictions within the 9-area county appeal their RENA allocation. I would say it's done in amount of Santa Clara County and Marin County. Those, on 24th, and I will be sitting on the appeals committee, and I would say, it's going to be very interesting. I will watch it carefully because depending on how RENA appeals are handled, the distribution formula is to redistribute any excess over to the entire region as a whole. So that means even though no one in Napa County District is advocating to appeal, that I think very much, it is possible that our numbers could fluctuate depending on how that appeal process goes. And I will be busy for the next 5 Fridays.
Thank you, Supervisor Ramos, for your service. Mayor Garcia, anything to add for ABAG?
Nothing further to add. Thank you.
Thank you very much. On MTC, while we were dark this month, we still had some meetings. Many of you know the Blue Ribbon Transportation Action Plan has come to a closure. And we really took the opportunity that, quite honestly, the pandemic provided us to look at our transportation systems in the region, really centered around the right of those that are using our public transportation systems most, really looking at how do you create better experiences, less connections, more predictability, more reliability. So this plan has concluded. It was approved by the program committee, and it's going to go into the full MTC commission. One of the things around this plan is action outcomes now, not period waiting. And those are called the accelerated steps, looking at wayfinding, so there's consistent mapping, no matter what system you're at, consistent fares. Many of us have taken multiple operators, know that sometimes the fare structure is unpredictable. We want to make that more predictable, benefit users. That's going to be coming to against the commission. But also, I've created a workshop as chair to really bring these together to talk about not just the outcomes, but how do you fund those outcomes, how do you prioritize those resources. And also, quite honestly, looking at the authority that has accomplished these outcomes. So it's going to be an uncomfortable conversation.
But very productive nonetheless. And we hear a little bit of an echo. I'll just pause. See none? All right, let's move on to our director's update. Director Miller. Let's do Patrick Band. Can you hear us in the back? Perfect. Okay, maybe a little bit more. Yes.
So first off, I'd like to introduce a new staff member to the board, Victoria. Want to wave? Victoria Ortiz.
Welcome.
Is going to be overseeing the Measure T program. She has a bachelor's degree from the University of California, San Diego in urban studies and political science. She interned at the Regional Planning Agency in San Diego, SANDAG, and worked for the Department of Public Works for the cities of San Diego and Cupertino. So welcome, Victoria. We're really happy to have you on our team. The bid openings for the Vine Transit Maintenance Facility was on September 8th, or 9th, I'm sorry. The good news is that we received 8 bids. They were all within $5 million of each other. The low bid was slightly higher than what we would have preferred, but we can delay a certain element of the project so that we can meet the low bid amount in terms of our funding availability. We're working with empty staff, though, to identify some additional revenue so that we don't have to do that. And either way, we'll still act quickly to meet the timeline of the TIFIA loan. Staff is still reviewing the bids, and we anticipate asking the board to award the contract this fall pending approval of the Build America Bureau and FTA. Napa Valley Forward Public Outreach Meeting is going to be held on September 22nd at 5:30 p.m. This will be a virtual meeting. The Napa Valley Transportation Authority and the Metropolitan Transportation Commission will jointly hold a public outreach for the intersection improvements at State Route 29 and Madison Street, Oakville Cross Road, and Rutherford Road. And as I mentioned, it will be a virtual meeting, and it's currently advertised on our website if you want to find out more information about that. On Monday, September 20th at 10 a.m., NVTA will hold a groundbreaking event for the Imola Park and Ride located at 957 Golden Gate Drive at Imola and State Route 29, and we look forward to seeing everybody there. The Transportation Security Administration has extended its mask mandate through January 18th, 2022. All transportation agencies receiving federal funding, including public transit agencies like the Vine Transit, are subject to the requirement, and therefore masks are required by all members of the public inside and outside of NVTA's facilities and vehicles. And that concludes my report.
All right, thank you, Director Miller. Any questions, either for our director or also ABAG and MTC? Seeing none, thank you very much, Director Miller. Let's move on to our consent calendar. We have 2 items. Do we have any public comment on our consent calendar? Seeing none, do we have it?
We do not.
All right, and we have no one virtually as well, as Laura confirmed. Do we have any director that wishes to make any questions? If not, I will entertain a motion. First by Canning, second by Joseph. Roll call vote, please.
Leon Garcia,
Yes.
Mark Joseph, Chris Canning, Liz Alessio,
Aye.
Scott Sedgley,
Yes.
Alfredo Pedroza,
Yes.
Belia Ramos, Paul Doring,
Yes.
Jeff Ellsworth,
Yes.
Carrie Gorman, John Dunbar. Motion passes.
All right, thank you very much. And I'll just note on consent, there was an item where MVTA was participating on a means-based transit pilot program, which is a really nice program to be participating in. So I want to thank our director for leading the way on that. Let's move on to our regular calendar. We do have one item that is an action item. This is 9.1, modifications of transit operation service agreement. This is found on page 17 to 21 of the agenda report. I believe we have a staff report on this item.
Good afternoon. Good board. My name is Antonio Morado, and I am the director of the Federal Transportation Authority. So for this item 9.1, staff is asking the NVTA board approve a modification to the new Transit Services Operations Agreement, number 21-12, specifically in section 3 of the contract, but it's also referenced in other sections, to revise the service hours and potentially add or reduce those service hours from a 20% threshold down to a 15% threshold without triggering a contract amendment. So back in the July meeting a couple months ago, the board of directors approved a new purchase transportation services contract with Transdev Services Incorporated for a base period of 5 years, beginning on January 1st, 2022 through December 31st, 2026, and potentially adding a couple of option years, which could extend the contract as far out as December 31st, 2028. At the time, the board gave the executive director authorization to make minor modifications and execute the agreement once all the parties have provided their respective comments and approvals. However, staff considered this a major revision and will need board consideration. So in the new contract, as it was currently drafted, provides the adjustment of service hours of plus or minus 20%. that could potentially reduce or in most likely case, grow the service hours with up to 22,526 hours without triggering a contract amendment. Transdev Services has asked NVTA to revise this provision from 20% to 15%. They've also asked their other clients for their new contracts for the same provision to be reduced as well. It should be noted that the new service hours in the new agreement is already 20% lower than the hours in the existing agreement. So Transdev has asked for this modification to ensure better financial predictability during the new contract period. Although it's highly unlikely another calamity would involve a steep drop in service hours, both NVTA and Transdev are making plans to ensure the viability and the continuity of the transit system if another disaster were occurred. But I think most other disasters often involve a temporary disruption in service or a reduction in service for a short period of time. So although NVTA can't guarantee another disaster would reduce service hours by 15% or more, the probability is low, and as I mentioned, most likely temporary. Because of this, staff is supportive of the request and understands Transdev's reasoning behind it. The change would not prohibit a 20% decrease or increase in service hours. It just means that such a change would need a contract amendment rather than just a notice to the service provider. In the report, in the memo, you'll see a table on page 20 that illustrates the potential cost impact if we reduced hours by either 20% or 15% in the delta between the two. Potentially, the impact could be $2,730,000. But the reality is the hours in the first year of the contract is already significantly below the contracted service hours under the current agreement. So the current agreement, we have budgeted about 133,500 hours. It's been reduced closer to about 105, 110,000 hours because of the pandemic. And so we're slowly growing. But in the new contract, we're starting out at 112,630 service hours. So at no point during the first 5 years of the new contract are we going to go as high as what we previously had budgeted of 133,500 hours. So given the number of the reduced service hours in the new agreement, NVTA would still be able to cut service hours to mirror the 2021 lockdown when we operated at 98,666 hours. That was at the start of lockdown, pretty much nearly shut down our services because there was simply no demand for it, other than the essential workers that we had to take to their work. So also too, we're looking at recovery and we're looking at growth. So we could potentially increase our services up to that 15% threshold and still not trigger, which will go on beyond the 133,000 service hours that we originally had in the current contract without triggering a contract amendment. So this is just more of a financial security for both NVTA and Transdev to ensure that either party, either organization is not left in a situation where the financial viability of either organization is at risk. And so staff believes it's a reasonable accommodation, and we're asking the board to allow for that revision in the new contract. And with that, I can answer any questions you may have.
All right, thank you very much, Antonio. So any initial questions from directors? Director Joseph.
Yes, just more to clarify that what's being proposed is that 15% threshold. So if something bad happened and we wanted to go beyond the 15%, Transdev could decline and say, I don't want to amend the contract. Or if you want me to amend the contract, it's not going to be $58 an hour, it's going to be a lot more. So that's why we want to have as high a level as we can.
That's correct.
And then the second clarification is, because we're starting at such a low level, it's more likely we will bump the top of the 15% than it is hitting the bottom of the 15%.
That's correct, because right now we're in recovery and we're experiencing modest growth. And so we're looking at actually increasing our services rather than decreasing our services. So,
and theoretically, if we bump the top of the 15%, Transdev, you would assume, would want the extra hours, but they may still try to take advantage of the opportunity by saying, oh, well, For some reason, I need to charge you more.
Right.
So
I mean, it's subject, once we hit that 15% threshold, it is subject to a contract amendment, which means rates can be renegotiated at that point.
Okay. All right. Well, it sounds reasonable, and I don't have any problems.
All right,
I just wanted to clarify it.
Good questions, Director Joseph. Thank you. I don't see any virtual, I do see a virtual hand. Director Doring, go ahead.
Thank you. Just a clarifying question. Does the threshold get renewed each year? In other words, you have to make a calculation after year one, after year two for the 15%, or do you start 15% from the very beginning of the contract?
It's a fixed amount, so it's 15% through the life of the contract.
Thank you.
All right, thank you, Director Doring. Don't see any other directors with any questions at this point. I'll ask if there's any member of the public that wishes to provide public comment on this item. Don't see anyone in person, Laura. Do we have anyone virtually?
We do not.
All right, so I'll bring it back to the board, and we've had discussion. If there's no further discussion, I will entertain a motion.
So move.
We have a first by Director Joseph,
Second, Garcia.
second by Director Sedgley. A roll call vote, please.
Leon Garcia,
Yes.
Mark Joseph,
Yes.
Chris Canning. Yes. Liz Alessio,
Aye.
Scott Sedgley,
Yes.
Alfredo Pedroza,
Yes.
Belia Ramos,
Yes.
Paul Doring,
Yes.
That was a yes.
Yes,
I think
yes,
that's
yes,
why it's a little low virtually, counterbalancing, I think, the acoustics.
Jeff Ellsworth,
Yes.
Carrie Dorman, and John Dunbar.
Yes.
Motion passes.
All right, thank you very much. I thought I would have the hardest job today, but I think it's going to be our audio rep. Thank you. All right, so motion passes. Let's move on to item 10. Any future agenda items? Seeing none. With that, we're going to adjourn the Napa Valley Transportation Authority meeting to our next meeting, which is October 20th. Meeting is adjourned. And Laura, whenever we can begin, I'll just wait for your approval.
Thank you. Do any board members need the Wi-Fi password, or members of the public? Do any of you need the Wi-Fi password?
Yes.
Okay. Please choose Napa Verasa Meeting as the Wi-Fi network. And the access code is lowercase NVTA 1002.
Could you run that by me again, please? It's Leon.
And with that, we are ready.
All
Hello,
right,
can
well,
you hear
good
me?
morning, everyone. I'm going to call to order the Napa Valley Transportation Authority meeting, the tax agency to order. And before we do roll call, I just want to thank our staff for putting this together. I know it's been hard to try to have in-person meetings during the pandemic, but it's so critical that we come together as an agency to talk about the future of some important measures that we want to talk about, and also in a very participating way. So again, thank the members of the public that are here today. So with that, if we can please do roll call.
Attendance was confirmed during roll call at the preceding NVTA meeting with 2 absences.
Wonderful. Thank you, Laura. Let's move on to item 3, the adoption of the agenda. Do we have any director with any questions? Do we have any member of the public that wishes to provide public comment on the adoption of the agenda? Don't see anyone in person. Do we have anyone virtually?
We do not.
All right, so with that, I will.
Dunbar.
We have first by
Second,
Dunbar.
Alessio.
So quick. Second by Vice Chair Alessio. Roll call vote, please.
Leon Garcia,
Yes.
Mark Joseph,
Yes.
Chris Canning. Yes. Liz Alessio,
Aye.
Scott Sedgley,
Yes.
Alfredo Pedroza,
Yes.
Belia Ramos.
Yes.
Jeff Ellsworth,
Yes.
Paul Doring,
Yes.
Carrie Dorman,
Yes.
and John Dunbar.
Yes.
Motion passes.
All right, thank you very much. Let's move on to public comment. Do we have anyone that wishes to address the tax agency on any item that's not on today's agenda? I don't see anyone in person. Do we have anyone virtually?
We do not.
All right, let's move on to item 5. This is our consent agenda. We have one item, which is the minutes. If there is no public comment in person or virtually, I will entertain a motion to approve the consent calendar.
So moved.
First by
Second.
Director Joseph,
Second Garcia.
second by Garcia. Roll call vote, please.
Leon Garcia,
Yes.
Mark Joseph,
Yes.
Chris Canning. Yes. Liz Alessio,
Aye.
Scott Sedgley.
Yes.
Alfredo Pedroza,
Yes.
Belia Ramos.
Yes.
Jeff Ellsworth,
Yes.
Paul Doring,
Yes.
Carrie Dorman, and John Dunbar.
I'll abstain since I was absent from the meeting.
Thank you.
All right, motion passes.
Motion passes.
Let's move on to the main event. 6.1 NVTA-TA Board Retreat Solving 4X. This is found on page 7 through 13. This is an informational item. We anticipate that we will hear a staff report and also maybe a presentation by some invited guests, and then we'll probably break for lunch, and then we'll come back for some Q&A after lunch, but that's what we plan for today. And again, I really want to thank, the board members for this opportunity. It's really us talking about the future, what's appropriate, what's not, but also what our interests are as a collective body. We all represent different municipalities, but to come together as a region for the benefit of those that live here and use our infrastructure, this is what today is about. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our director, Kate Miller.
Well, good morning again. I first wanted to just acknowledge that staff recognizes is sort of weird timing. But we have been working on this for a year, and we also thought that we might have limited time because the midterms are coming up pretty quickly. But you will hear from polling results that maybe the midterm isn't the best time to go out and do anything if the board decides that that's what we're going to do. So we did a rush, and here we are, and we have plenty of time, which is great in a lot of ways because it'll give you some opportunity to give us feedback on what maybe might be the next steps. Things change. There's an opportunity for us to do a few other things before the general election, if in fact, again, that's what the board has decided to do. So we are going to focus on options for changing up how we use the half-cent sales tax for transportation in Napa Valley. And I just also wanted to make sure that everybody was aware that any changes to the sales tax measure would have to be supported by voter approval. And so staff has dubbed a potential new ballot initiative Measure X, not knowing what it may be. And Measure X also acknowledges that we don't know all the answers and that modeling performance of a new measure is just that. It's based on projections and the best information that we have available. So today's presentation has therefore been titled Solving for X. Today's retreat, again, is an opportunity for the board to consider a number of possibilities that can improve how we use the scarce financial resources to improve transportation in Napa Valley. Next slide. So we're going to start with a Measure T overview to remind everybody what is in the current measure. And then we'll discuss some of the issues and concerns that prompted an evaluation of the existing measure. And then we'll present options to change the measure that will include the staff analyses that supports these changes. And then our two guest speakers, Barry Barnes of TWBH Props and Measures, and John Whaley of Goodwin Simon Strategic Research will share polling results. And the balance of the time will be for the board to discuss the presentation and even consider additional options for change for the potential ballot measure. So next slide, please. So we're going to start with the Measure T overview. Next slide. Did it get stuck?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay, there we go.
Screen sharing to Zoom at the moment.
So staff looked at Measure T in relationship to some of the other measures. There's 23 other counties in California that have or sales tax measures. Some of them have over 1%, but many of them have a 0.5%, similar to Napa's. But first and foremost, staff believes that we can do a lot better by bonding against future revenue. And if we were going to go out, we should probably go out for a 30-year measure instead of the 25-year measure that Measure T is. And we think even when we do that, and we will provide very comparable or a slightly increased funding for local streets and roads, but we'll still be able to set aside $60 million in new revenues for major capital projects. And this is all net of bonding costs. Staff would also like to discuss how we might want to talk about the 6.67% requirement within the measure. And then we also would need to probably increase the administrative oversight that we currently receive from 1% to 2%. And then there's some other elements that we would like to do to be able to deliver capital projects a little bit more effectively. Next slide. So just a little refresher on Measure T. It's a half-cent sales tax for 25 years. It became operative July 1st, 2018. The voters did approve it in 2012. And it is specifically for the maintenance and rehabilitation of local streets and roads. Next slide. It is distributed on a fixed percentage formula to the jurisdictions and is anticipated to generate about $612 million over the life of the measure. Next slide.
Excuse me, Chair, we're not seeing the slides on
this
the
chart shows
remote access.
Allow me to pause and see if I can fix that. Thank you.
So it sounds like we might have some technical issues, so we're just going to pause for a second, see if those that are attending virtually can also get the benefit of these slides.
You got it? Okay,
Problem
great.
solved. Thank you.
Thank you. That works now.
So
Thank
this
you.
chart shows the amount of revenues that have been generated and distributed to each jurisdiction so far over the 3-year period that the measure has been active. Next slide. Even though the funds are trickling in quarterly, the jurisdictions have made a lot of headway and delivered a lot of what we promised to the voters. In total, the jurisdictions have completed 89 projects covering roughly 22.5 road miles and 24 linear feet of sidewalk and 238 accessible ramps. Next slide. So the next section explains how NVTA staff define the need and the things to evaluate so we can improve performance in the future. Excuse me, this happens with masks. That and fogging glasses. The pavement condition index, or PCI score, is how pavement condition is measured in the MTC region. The Metropolitan Transportation Commission developed this modeling tool called Street Saver, and the score produced by Street Saver is a factor of the condition of the road, the lane miles, and the funds a jurisdiction has available for road rehabilitation and maintenance. Next slide. So the jurisdictions receive state funding from Senate Bill 1, local streets and road funds, and other local funds to maintain roads, including general funds, local developer fees, and Measure T. Sometimes we use Regional Transportation Improvement Program funds or STIP state funds, but that has been sort of frowned upon in recent years by the California Transportation Commission, and the NVTA board has adopted principles that prioritize those funds for highway improvements. So the combined fund sources available for road and maintenance are barely sufficient to keep up with the current condition of the road because it's simply not enough, and most jurisdictions are still catching up on years of deferred maintenance. I'd also note that Senate Bill 1, which was signed into law in 2017, doubled the amount of state funds that jurisdictions receive. But even with these new revenues, PCI scores will continue to go down. And the PCI scores that you see on the slide were developed in Street Saver by NVTA staff and reflect the most recent, and I would just underscore, unpublished PCI scores. So they're not going to be consistent with the MTC report because those figures are not out yet. So just to give you a feeling for reference, a score of 80 and above is considered very good. And our closest jurisdiction to that is Yountville, and I can't see completely from here. I think they're at 76. So they'll give you a feeling, and they're pretty stellar. I think when we go to Yountville, we can kind of get that feeling. 60 to 69 is fair. At risk is.
Mayor Dunbar's having a moment.
Do we need to pause for Mayor Dunbar to acknowledge? Yeah.
All right, let's.
I did say that the score had to do with lane miles too, so.
Steve Rogers wants to provide public comment, so let's keep going.
And 70, 79, between 70 and 79 is good. 60 to 69 is fair, and at risk is 50 to 59, and below is 49 is poor. It should be emphasized that this is not a reflection on how well your staff are performing, but rather a reflection that revenues are coming in just simply too slow to make a necessary dent in the deferred maintenance. Does that make you feel a little bit better? Yeah, okay, good.
No.
Next slide, please. So this chart is probably, and you're going to see it again because we think it's really important. This is what happens over the life of Measure T to PCI scores. They just continue to decline. And again, this has a lot to do with the value of money as it declines and project cost escalation. Next slide. So one of the challenges is that Measure T doesn't allow for bonding, and bonding would bring the funds forward and allow the jurisdictions to deliver road treatments when they are needed. You'll see from polling data that will be presented later in the presentation that a key interest of the community is transportation. And we cannot make improvements on how infrastructure operates with the funds that are currently available to us. Measure T is also inflexible that it has a number of requirements that detract from road rehabilitation and limitations that prevent meaningful improvements in the valley's transportation infrastructure. Next slide. So while the jurisdictions have delivered a lot of improvements to date, almost half of the funding generated is being banked at very low interest earning account, pending additional revenues to deliver and develop projects. And bonding against future funds would rectify this by providing the funds again to the jurisdictions when they are needed. Next slide. So as we bank these funds at, again, very low interest earning accounts, the construction cost escalations are going up much faster. This last year alone, construction escalation costs are at 10%. And you can see in this chart that the bar on the left is what we're earning in interest on those banked funds, and the bar on the right are the escalation factors in the last 3 years. Next slide. So what can we do to build a better sales tax program? Next slide. NVTA staff has been working on preparing for today's meeting for over a year. And as part of that effort, we formed a Measure X working group, which was comprised of NVTA staff, your public works directors, the chair of the Independent Taxpayer Oversight Committee, and the executive director of the Napa Bicycle Coalition. And we spent a lot of time meeting and discussing what we could do to make the measure work better for us. Staff also work with consultants to develop a financial model that would model project cost escalation, bonding cost, and compares the purchasing power of today's revenues to that of future revenues and how these factors influence PCI scores. We also looked at how much funding could be taken off the top for capital project without destabilizing the PCI scores. Next slide. So understanding how the value of money changes over time is key in understanding how bonding can improve PCI scores, even when roughly half the nominal funds are needed for bonding costs and debt payment. So the $500 million that would be set aside under a Measure X, it only represents the money that we would have available for local streets and road rehab in that measure. So, and over the 30-year life of Measure X, the purchasing power of the dollar is diminished by 43.2%. So $500 million in today's terms is really only $284 million in future value, or what we would be able to buy. Next slide. And well, I wanted to illustrate how our financial modeling worked, just to give you an overview. So the model allowed us to understand how much funding is available by evaluating changes in construction costs, inflationary factors, bond underwriting costs and issuance, debt service, the number of tranches, and when the funds would be available to us. Next slide. The estimated revenues over the life of Measure X is roughly $800 million, and that's nominal value. However, if we bond and bring the funds forward, an additional $246 million in purchasing power would be available to us. And after bonding costs are factored in, there is roughly $560 million available, which is more than twice the purchasing power available under Measure T. Next slide. One of the key discussions with the Measure X working group was the current Measure T distribution to the jurisdictions. And staff was told that the current formula was based on lane miles, population, return to source, but we could not replicate that formula. Next slide. So we looked at a number of different analyses, including maintaining the existing formula, lane miles, vehicle miles traveled, return to source, need, which was a function of revenues, road condition, and road miles to optimize PCI scores, and a number of hybrids of these to understand how various formulas would influence PCI scores. Next slide. And we received a lot of feedback from your staff. And this was probably the crux of most of our discussion. So while the working group agreed that the formula would be revisited every 5 years, because right now the formula in Measure T is stagnant for the 25-year period, they wanted to ensure that the formula for identifying percentages would be constant. So we needed to identify a proxy formula that was agreeable to the jurisdictions, but also optimize PCI scores. The larger jurisdictions wanted to maintain Measure T, and the smaller jurisdictions wanted a straight return to source formula. Next slide. So we went back to the drawing board and tried to balance those interests. And what we landed on is another hybrid that both recognizes and rewards the municipal jurisdictions for new development and acknowledges that everybody drives on county roads. Adjusted over time, it will continue to reward jurisdictions for new sales tax revenues and continue to support county roads. So the formula that we're proposing is that we start with the city's return to source, and then the county would be 50% return to source and 50% lane miles. And then we normalize it to 100%. Everybody gets a slight haircut. And the percentage distribution is very close to what we have under Measure T. Next slide. So this kind of shows you a pie chart visual of the distribution and the revenues that the Measure T would distribute and the revenues that Measure X would distribute. Next slide. And again, I remind you, if we do nothing, this is what happens to PCI scores. They dramatically decline over the remaining period in Measure T. Next slide. If we move forward with a Measure X, this is what happens under the Measure T formula is the first chart. So if we stay with the same chart, but if we go to the Measure X proposed formula, which again is the return to source to the city jurisdictions and a hybrid of 50-50 return to source and lane miles for the county, it actually improves the PCI scores. Next slide. So if we move forward with a Measure X, that is what happens to PCI scores. Oh, this chart shows the distribution under Measure T with no bonding, the left column. And the middle column is Measure X distributed under a Measure T formula. And the final one is a Measure X distributed using the newly proposed formula. So it's pretty close on the percentage. You can see there's significant more money under Measure X, but again, because of the bonding and bringing the funds forward, we have much more purchasing power. And I'll just, call it the way it is. If you look at the percentages, you see that there's a slight reduction for American Canyon and a slight reduction for the County of Napa. The way American Canyon is developing, probably in 5 years, when we go back to the drawing board and readjust the percentage, it's likely to go up again. The county is probably likely to remain stable over the 30-year period. Next slide. One of the other challenges in Measure T is 6.67% element. It requires jurisdictions and NVTA to collectively commit to 6.67% equivalent of Measure T in other eligible revenues for Class 1. So what this means is that we have to gather other funds that are eligible within the measure and commit that money to Class 1 facilities. It's not Measure T funds. I just want to underscore that. Staff believes that we should be following plans for implementing bicycle and pedestrian facilities rather than an arbitrary funding requirement to deliver the Valley's bicycle and pedestrian priorities. This element is also difficult to administer. We are meeting that commitment, but it's being committed for future projects or to address shortfalls that would have been addressed anyway. We are banking funds because the annual committed amount is only $1.3 million a year, which doesn't even fund anymore 1 mile of Class 1 facility. I would also note that the requirement was put into place when funding that used to come to regions and counties directly was lopped off by the state for the active transportation program. So those funds are no longer eligible to meet this requirement. We think it would make more sense to come to a formal agreement outside the ordinance, commit funding from the ordinance to funding the Vine Trail or Class 1 facilities for class facility projects included in the countywide bicycle and pedestrian plans. Jurisdiction staff have also commented that if this requirement must stay in a future ordinance, that it should be expanded to all bike and pedestrian facilities, because on-road system facilities has a stronger nexus to the purpose of the ordinance and has a greater likelihood of encouraging more biking and walking. Staff would also like to build in additional flexibility in the ordinance to improve project delivery. I mentioned that before. How that would work is for projects funded in a proposed measure that are also funded in, say, the outer years of the STIP, to be able to use Measure T money to fund those funds earlier on would actually reduce, again, the cost because we're bringing the funds forward, able to deliver projects sooner, and that could save millions and millions of dollars to the county and also really improve our infrastructure. Next slide. If the NVTA board is supportive of the bonding and capital program proposals that we've outlined, we also believe that we need to increase the administrative fees. We currently at 1%, we would need to increase those to at least 2% to help with bonding and also capital project oversight. All the figures you've seen today factor in that 2% amount. It is still relatively small. Some of the self-help counties take as much as 5% off the top to administer the sales tax. Next slide. So our modeling suggests that we can pull $60 million out of the program for capital projects and still provide the jurisdictions with more funding that would be provided under Measure T if we bond. We polled for a number of capital projects, and these are the projects that surface to the top. You'll see a theme. People are interested in bike and pedestrian facilities, especially those that are directed at children, like safe routes to school. Next slide. And major highway improvements that improve traffic conditions. They also supported a traffic control center that can help direct traffic during emergencies or when signals are out. I know that Director Ramos would like that very much. Or when there are crashes on the highway. Next slide. And they also supported fare subsidies for vets and low-income adults. The only comment I would make there is that anytime we have a programmatic takedown, that reduces the amount of funds that we have for local streets and roads and for other capital projects. And as we pointed out on the consent calendar today, NVTA continues to support subsidizing low-income adult fares through MTC's Clipper Start program. Next slide. And I just also want to say that we would not be able to wholly fund any particular project with the proposed $60 million set aside. Instead, we'd use the funds for pre-construction to get the project shelf ready. Makes us more competitive with other counties and other areas in the state. We could be, the pre-construction could cost as much as 15% of the total project cost, so that's pricey, and we just don't have the resources for that now. And we can also leverage sales tax for federal and state competitive funds. If we have a matching fund and a good project, then we become a lot more competitive. But the board may also wish to consider an increase in the sales tax. And while we did not pull for that, there's an opportunity with the pending Assembly constitutional amendment that is sponsored by Al Gore Curry that would reduce the voter threshold by 55% for transportation measures. And that probably would put us over the top if we wanted to do that. But there's other things that we also need to consider, like what else is on the ballot. I know that MTC is interested in some sort of housing measure, and I know open space also is interested. So, we would obviously need to balance that with whatever is going on, and if we decide to go to the voters for a change. So this next section will provide the polling results. I want to introduce Barry Barnes of TWBH Props and Measures and John Whaley of Goodwin-Simon Strategic Research. And they're going to walk you through the next 20 slides or so.
Thank you, Kate. Is this on? Okay. Thanks very much. I'm Barry Barnes with TBWBH Props and Measures. Good to see many familiar faces out there. Our firm, or I in particular, had the pleasure of working with Kate and then Supervisors Dodd, now Senator Dodd, but then Supervisor Dodd and Supervisor Caldwell and others on Measure T way back when that was extended and renewed, and glad to see that it's been able to provide so many great improvements with a lot of needs still to be addressed. So I'm here with my colleague John Whaley from Goodwin-Simon today to report on the findings from a poll that was conducted in May that looked specifically at the likelihood of extending Measure T, renewing the measure. And I think without any further ado, I'll turn it over to John. I'll be coming back toward the end to talk about the some of the conclusions we've come to, as well as answer any questions. So with that, John.
Thank you, Barry. And thanks to Director Miller and her team. This has been a really collaborative effort as we've designed a survey instrument that I think was very beneficial, both for how you think about this measure, but also for Napa County residents and voters, as they were given a lot of information about this proposed measure. And so as a researcher, I appreciate that a lot of effort went in to share the details underneath the measure. Next slide, please. So this is was conducted as what we call a hybrid poll. This gives the respondents lots of options to take it. It was presented as an option. You could take it by phone, you could take it online. We contacted people via their cell phones. Also, some older folks like me still have landlines, and about 17% did in fact take it on their landline phone. But it was all based on a voter file that was representative of Napa County registered voters, so a mix of residents, and we had about 500 total interviews for a margin of error of 4.4 percentage points. And if people have any technical questions, I'm happy to come back to the methodology in a moment. But if we can go to the next slide. The first thing that we did, and hopefully people can see the title, we just asked people in an open-ended fashion, what are the main challenges, most important problems facing Napa County today and into the future? So what you're seeing here are the coded categories, kind of the themes that emerge from their own open-ended comments. And so over a third, 36% of Napa County voters raised issues around affordable housing or rent control. 19% traffic congestion, 18% fire, wildfires. Now, keep in mind, this was polled in May, so perhaps in the summer, wildfires might have been a little bit more salient. But you'll notice that the second item, traffic and congestion, and the fourth item, transportation, infrastructure, roads, are both around the issues we're talking about today. So those are very prominent issues for Napa County voters. Next slide, please. And then we gave them the text of a proposed ballot measure. So the measure as follows: to improve highways and major roads, fix potholes, maintain local roads, reduce traffic congestion, provide reliable bus service, make walking and bicycling safer in Napa, American Canyon, St. Helena, Calistoga, Yountville, and Napa County. Shall a countywide measure modifying and extending the existing transportation 0.5% sales tax for 30 years be approved without increasing overall tax rate. I won't go into all of it, but we want to make sure that the respondents see the full scope of it. But then we also gave them more information. So next slide, please. We laid out the specific goals and objectives associated with this transportation plan, and then asked the respondents, does that goal or objective make you much more likely to vote yes in favor, somewhat more likely to vote yes, somewhat more likely to vote no, to oppose it, or much more likely to vote no? And so throughout this presentation, I want you to really focus on the brightest colors. So in this case, the dark blue is yes, this objective makes me much more likely. That's the intensity measure. And then the dark red is the no, that makes me much more likely to vote no against it. And we see that the dark blue is really quite prominent across each of these measures, each of these objectives. And in our work, we always look at something that is really sort of jumping out to people that is effective as something that reaches the 30% threshold for that dark blue measure. And these are all well over 30% there. So we also, look at the lighter blue too, but that dark blue for us is really important. But you'll notice some themes. So fixing potholes, repairing crumbling roads, and maintaining neighborhood streets, that really rises to the top. So these kind of really bread and butter, how it feels, how the road feels to you is critically important. But also this idea around emergency, improving the county's evacuation and emergency road access is really important. But not surprisingly, we see concerns around easing traffic, rush hour congestion, et cetera. So I won't read through all of these, but there are actually 3 slides, and I encourage everyone to look through the different goals, because you'll see, if you go to the next slide, each of these different kind of summary goals and objectives polls very well across overall, but also across major subgroups. And then if you go to the last slide, the ones that are maybe appeal a little bit more to certain audiences, they are still important. But so, for example, increasing the number of trips taken using transit, walking, or bicycling, that does not necessarily resonate with people who only drive. But even then, we see much more blue color than red. And so if I go to the next slide, this is where I was mentioning at the top how much I appreciate all the detail that we were given to the respondents. So not only were we talking broadly about goals and objectives, but we mentioned that there are over 100 specific projects that the measure would support, and we gave them some specific examples, even down to the street names. So the most sort of effective one from a communication standpoint is this reducing traffic congestion on Highway 29. I imagine that affects almost everyone in the county, but also around creating additional safe routes to schools, constructing a new interchange at Highway 29, Jameson Canyon Airport Boulevard. And one little experiment we did, which is kind of interesting, is that you'll see the 4th item that's in italics. We asked this question 2 different ways. Half of the respondents saw or heard that the measure would improve traffic flow and safety at the intersection of Silverado Trail, Conesville Road, 3rd Street, and East Avenue. And then if you go to the next slide, the very last item is what the other half of the respondents heard. So that would build a roundabout to improve traffic flow and safety at the intersection of Silverado Trail. Now, you'll see that it still polls quite well. There's much more blue than red, but there is something about roundabouts that is, I think, unfamiliar at the very least for not just Napa County residents, but I would say citizens of this country in general. So there's some reticence, but it doesn't necessarily doom that particular project. But just something to keep in mind that it's going to be important to help educate and make people feel comfortable with that kind of transportation project. Next slide, please. So I'm showing two different votes here. So the first vote is the initial vote after people just read the basic ballot measure, just the details by itself. We see that almost 2/3 say they would vote yes, another 31% say no, and only 4% are undecided. The informed vote on the right is the vote after people learn more about the objectives, the goals, the specific projects. And there's very, very little change, which is somewhat unusual when we do these kinds of polls. We often see as you learn more about something, you change your attitude, either positively or negatively. But this is something where it's clear from the ballot measure language itself that people have a pretty good idea of what it's going to do, and it sits in their own kind of way they think about the world and how they want to, what they consider important to support. And there's very little change even after we give them more. But that's important in a couple of different ways. Do you want to just accept that? The meeting's being recorded, it looks like.
Sure hope it is.
Yes. Hopefully that started a while ago.
Kathy, can you accept that? Okay, one
I think
moment.
it's you.
So someone is controlling that, I'm assuming, right?
Yes.
Okay, no worries.
Well, this is a good slide to
It gives us time to digest all the numbers.
Exactly. This is an important one.
Stand by.
All right, no worries.
Who's running the PowerPoint presentation?
And we can always take a quick break if necessary to give. You know, why don't we, let's take a 5-minute break and then we'll come back in 5 minutes. That gives us time to stretch our legs, have a cup of coffee, maybe use the restroom. So we'll be back in 5 minutes.
Did you hear me thank staff? I don't think I did. I think I ran over.
Oh.
I forgot to thank my staff.
My legs.
I'll do it at the end. I don't think I did.
Was that?
I did? Oh, and I listed all of them? Okay. I didn't? Okay.
Show me what you
All right. Hey, Barry.
You're so close, Ron.
Oh, the September 22nd, it's not a roundabout meeting. It's the Napa Valley Forward, State Route 29 intersection improvements. Roundabouts are just one of the options that we're looking at. It's Madison, Rutherford, and Oakville
So
Cross.
let's not do extend then, so that I don't.
It's at 5:30, and it's going to be virtual, and we'll send a press release. Imola Park and Ride, groundbreaking is on Monday at September 10th, 20th, I think.
PowerPoint?
I don't know where my notes.
Oh, okay.
That's at 10. Let me just double check. We're a little bit behind our press releases because, yeah, it's at 10 on September 20th. our PIO is out, so.
Okay, but we want to go to hide video panel, so we can take that off. Will that work?
It stabilizes. It doesn't go up
We also
very
wanna-
much. It goes up slightly. It depends on the jurisdiction. If you look at the detail, you'll see some of them slightly go up, some of them slightly go down, some of them stay about the same. But it's, yeah, I mean, that's the problem. There isn't enough funding available for.
I know.
Yeah, I think when we started this, before we started modeling things, I could have made those charts do anything I wanted. We really thought that they would probably go up and still we'd be able to take money down, but even with the $60 million that we're taking out of the program or proposing to take out for the program for capital development, it still doesn't do much. So, an increase would help, but, it just depends on what the board wants to do in terms of
And I
whether or
can
not they
just
want to
do
take capital
and
funds
show.
off the top. So, yeah.
Yeah.
Because like everybody else's funds, right, Barry, come in annually or quarterly, right? They're not coming in big chunks when they're needed. So it does just maintain things. It doesn't improve the condition of the roads. That's why SB1 was an easy one for legislators because we said, this is what's happening to our pavement. And we hadn't seen an increase since the 90s when SB1 came about, that if you're not going to do anything at all, we're not able to do anything either. We're just not going to be able to maintain it. So at least that they got to a place where we're obviously going to need to do something besides what we're doing now. Gas tax, as you know, is not a percentage of the sales, it's a flat rate. So there's just things that, things are not, and I think we all thought the gas tax or the amount of revenues would go up because people continue to consume gas, but we're not doing that anymore either. What would that cost?
Are we good to go?
Yeah, it would probably twice as much as what we're getting. It's not possible. But if we keep it at where we are, it's not that bad.
So let me,
None of the road here are poor. It's not like Sonoma County.
hide the floating meeting. Actually, I want to.
So, yeah, I think like, if you look in the lines, I think you'll see St. Helena's goes up. The counties goes, I think slightly up, and, because they get so much, they're getting more, the value of the money they're getting is more, right? Everybody's getting more.
Okay, so.
Because the purchasing power of the money when they're getting it is so much higher than it is in future years, right? And they're getting almost twice as much. So if we got 3 times as much or 4 times as much, we could probably proportionally see that we'd probably start increasing at some point.
45?
Yeah. I think that if the board is interested in increasing the sales tax, then I think a portion of it would have to go to local streets and roads.
Initial and forms, like post office.
How are you doing? That's right. I don't want to interrupt this flow. It is a dream. What's going on, Barry? I'm one meeting at a time, Barry. So tomorrow's closed session. There's a few items. It's typically
High
two-thirds.
flood image
Yeah.
control.
Of course. Yeah, thanks for joining us.
Well, I think we've got a pretty good case to make on that front, so.
What's going on, Mayor? Wow, you guys are playing golf? Interesting. Yeah, some of us have work. Some of us have work. Yes, same with every Tuesday. Support our community. All right. We're going to ask everyone if you can find yourself to a seat. We're going to get started. All right. I'm going to start singling folks out. Director Canning. We're going to get started momentarily. Executive Director Miller. We're going to get started here momentarily. I decided to coach sports, so I've learned when you call the kids by name, not saying I'm calling kids, but I've learned a different trait. Yeah. There's 20 kids on this soccer team. Well, thank you all for coming back so quickly. I know that we have this presentation to get through. It's a great presentation. So I think we've analyzed our tech issues and we navigated them. So let's continue, please.
Great, thank you. So this was a good place to take a little intermission because this was kind of the intermission in the poll. So after we gave the respondents lots of just very neutral information about the poll, then we gave them some messaging statements, some reasons to oppose the poll, or I'm sorry, oppose the measure, and then reasons to support the measure. So the next slide, please, shows the results for opposition statements. So here are reasons people might give to vote against the transportation tax measure. And then we asked for each one of them, does that statement make you much more likely to vote against it, somewhat more likely to vote against it, or whether it makes no difference, or if you think the statement is false or it makes you more likely to support the measure, they can say that as well. So some people do, in fact, sense that something doesn't quite sound true or realistic, so we allow people to provide that response as well.
Can I just jump in for
Sure.
1 second here, John? I do think it's worth looking at the bottom two, which were the least effective negative arguments that were tested. One of them, the second to the bottom, was kind of the typical bureaucracy argument. That was only 20%, much more, and I know a total of 32%. Total that would oppose because of that, and then the roundabout. So we talked about the roundabouts earlier, but when you actually test it as a negative, it's not particularly salient. So I think it's really more of an issue where some additional public information and communication can be helpful, but there's not. It's not the response to that earlier question we highlighted is not driving any sort of a negative vote.
Thanks, Barry. That's absolutely right. What we do see is, you recall earlier I mentioned how in our world, our threshold for an effective statement is 30% on the intensity measure, the dark color, dark red in this case. And it does seem that the real sort of winner from an opposition statement is around taxes. Just the idea that Napa County residents already pay way too much in taxes and fees, and this would be an additional burden. But, you know, even still, we see over a third of voters say that really doesn't make a difference for them. And so it is something that I would expect would be a message that we would hear a lot in any campaign, as we see in measures similar to this one. Question.
I noticed there was no question relative to bonding and the idea that if you borrow money, you won't be able to pay for it as a factor, because that was one of the issues raised in the original Measure T.
It was not a specific message statement that we tested.
But it's in the language.
It is in the language itself, right? And so
That might have been nice to know, because I think from my perspective, that bonding element is really what makes it an exciting opportunity. And it would be nice to see if the rest of the public thinks that way.
now we do have some in the pro measure statements that you'll see in just a moment. We do talk about the way that this measure can leverage other funds. So let me get to that in just a moment.
And I just also want to, one of the questions that we're going to ask the board to discuss is whether or not we should do additional polling if there is an interest in moving forward with the measure eventually. Again, this is a no decision day, right? It's just information day, but that is something that I think is an important question to ask, or if we're going to go out for a future poll.
Let's try to hold questions towards the end if we can, and then we'll have plenty of time if that's right. Thank you, Director. Continue.
Thank you. So just to go through the remaining opposition statements, none of them reached in the 30% threshold for effectiveness, but we do imagine that there would be, you know, and to Barry's point, which is absolutely true, roundabouts in themselves are not a sort of fatal flaw. And in fact, when we measured all by itself, far more voters say that that would make no difference to them, or is even a false claim, than those say that it would make them much more likely to oppose. Next slide, please. So after the opposition messages, we did another vote, and the stability across votes throughout the survey is quite striking. So yes, there was a little drop off in support from 68% overall down to 64%, but very little sort of in the grand scheme in terms of drop. And in some surveys, we see pretty significant movement up and down over the course of a survey as people learn more. But in this case, it does seem like the voters have a pretty good sense of what this is all about and whether this is something that they would support, and even messages that would try to really drive support downward don't have much of a bite, which is somewhat unusual for certain kinds of surveys. If we go to the next slide, we'll just, then we gave the respondents statements in support of the measure. And we see, and there are a couple of slides here, I won't go through all of them, but there are a couple of things that really stand out. First is this idea that there are matching funds. This measure will allow Napa County to leverage millions of dollars in federal and state transportation grants. That was really important for people. 39% much more likely to support after hearing that. This measure includes strict caps on how the funds are spent, with at least 97% of funds going directly to improving roads and transit. 43% much more likely to support. The Emergency Operations Center is also a popular component here. The fact that the measure would ease traffic, and then this point at the end here is something we see is really, really important to emphasize in any type of measure where there is accountability. So this would include tough accountability features to ensure the funds are used efficiently, fairly, and as promised. Next slide. And additional arguments that are important. We see that this is around improving health is important. That the plan renews Napa County's commitment toward walking and biking as a solution to not only traffic congestion, but greenhouse gas emissions and improving the general health and well-being of Napa County. Mass transit gets some support as well, and that this would make local bus travel faster and more reliable. So overall, we see much more blue than red on these pro measure statements, including nearly all of them that reach above 30% in the intensity measure. Next slide. So where does that leave us? The final vote, after hearing all this information, again, striking stability in the votes. As people learn more about it, they're given reasons to oppose it, given reasons to support it. There is some shift, but it starts at 65 and really ends at 65. You do see, if you look at the dark blue, a little increase in the definitely yes proportion of voters. But really it's largely stable across, even with more information. But one important difference when it comes to timing that we'll talk about in just a moment about when you may want to run this measure. You go to the next slide, please. So because we use the voter file to draw a sample of respondents to call, we know how many times people vote. Again, your voting record is public, but what your actual vote is not. So we know if people vote a lot, frequently, or not so much. So on the right are the respondents who they voted in almost every election. So in the last 6 elections, they voted at least 5 times, if not 6 times in all the elections. And for them, support is mostly stable from the initial to the final vote, maybe drops a point. But that's a pretty stable electorate. But on the left are the voters who either haven't voted yet, because maybe they just registered to vote after the general election in 2020, or maybe they voted once or twice. We actually see an increase in support among those voters, not only in the overall from 70 to 75% after learning more, but in the dark blue from 44% to 50% saying definitely yes. So that's an important component as we think about when this measure would be good to run. And with that, I'll turn it over to Barry and for the next slide, please.
Thanks. I just wanted to point out one other, could you go back just 2 slides to the up, down, that one, yeah. Just to reinforce what John said, I mean, this is really amazing stability. The margin of error, as John stated in the beginning, is 4 points on this. So, it's all, even from the low point to the high point, is within the margin of error. And, I actually had a client in a different county with a similar testing a non-transportation countywide measure at the same time in May. And once the negatives were presented, the bottom literally fell out. I mean, it went from like 64 to 52 or something like that. Once those very similar negative arguments about taxes and kind of your standard negative arguments. So the fact that we that the messages maintained that stability is really shows a strong core there. It shows that people do respond significantly to the messages, and particularly I thought it was striking on you don't have to take the slide back, but there was a slide a couple ago where it showed that the transit the importance of supporting transit, or the transit improvements. Actually, could you go back a couple? I think that was 1 back or 2 back. That one, exactly. Even if you look here, you notice that while the dark blue is on the lowest part of the scale, the negative folks it's a very small percentage. It's only 16% who would either say false or less likely to support on those bottom 2, as opposed to 28 to 32% who just say makes no difference, which is fine. That's just not what's driving them, but they're not responding negatively to the transit piece of it. So I thought that was another striking, along with the prior mentioned traffic circle comments, that many of the types of projects which may score at the bottom don't have the same intensity with everybody, but they are they're not bringing a lot of negativity. And you can go ahead and flip forward to where we were leaving off, please. And I think also, as John pointed out, that the less likely voters, the folks who tend to vote in a presidential election, a high turnout general election, those also typically correspond with the folks who are going to be utilizing public transit, who are more concerned about bicycle safety and access. And so that, it's not surprising. It's not surprising, with many tax measures do much better with a higher turnout. I mean, we're in California, higher turnout, more tax-friendly voters. That's just not a big surprise. So as we say on this slide, the highest turnout, the highest projected turnout in the next 4 years will be, I think it's very safe to say, will be the presidential election of November 2024. Will the turnout in November of 2022 be low and similar to how it was in 2014, or 2018 in the prior gubernatorial races? As we sit here today, I think it probably will be, and especially if the current polls hold and the recall goes down by a significant margin tomorrow, then I think that the turnout could be very low next year, because there could be a much less competitive statewide race if the recall is rejected by 10 or more points. And so, we could have potentially record low turnout in 2022 and not only in the general election, but in the primary as well. And when we're on the bubble like this, when we're looking at gaps, and when you look at that gap that John pointed out of 75% of the less likely voters coming in as supporters, those are folks who typically they vote in presidential elections, and that election would be the most representative of the entirety of the county. And then also, as we say, again, anything on the bubble, anything in the mid 60s, opposition is something that is not helpful. And if there is opposition, if folks are making some of those opposition points, particularly if it's funded, that's going to be harder to sustain for a measure. And I'm raising these points because it's a big decision for all of you as a board to put something on the ballot. It costs money to put something on the ballot. And so this is why, boards and agencies that we work with want to know, what is the likelihood if we go down the road and spend the funds to prepare for the measure and to place the measure on the ballot, what is the likelihood that the voters would like to see that on that ballot and support? And that's why, we point this out. There has been opposition to pretty much every tax measure in Napa. Some it's taken down, some it hasn't taken down. That's just, the name of the game. But the lower the turnout you get, the greater the impact that it typically has. I think that's the last of our slides. If you could go forward, I think the next slide just says questions, discussion, and next steps. So.
All right. Well, we're ahead of schedule, which is great. So why don't we do at least 30 minutes of Q&A, and then we'll break for lunch around noon, and then we'll come back around 12:30. So that way it's still fresh on our minds. So at this point, we'll start with some Q&A. I know Director Dorman had a question, so I want to go to her first, and then we can just work through our other directors. Director Dorman. And I think we're sharing mics a little bit if responsibly.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for the reports, both our staff and our consultants. I want to start with the consultants, please. Your sample ballot question had a figure of $20 million as the total, and I believe that our executive director had said that we were expecting 6.12 million over the life of the current Measure T. Is it just the length of the measure, or is there some other reason that the figure is so different?
So I think, when we first passed Measure T, it was around 20 million. It's about 23 million now. So that's just the difference between what we're actually generating and what we would it's 20 million now, but it will be more than that in future years, right? Because the people will be spending more money, inflation.
So what is the 6.12 million? What figure is that?
You mean the 612 million?
612
is the
million.
cumulative amount over the 25-year period
Of Measure T.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And then on the recent slides about where you showed just the negatives and just the positives, it says down at the bottom, ranked by total more likely to vote yes. So did that include only the answers to those questions? Does that mean that included, your data set included only the people who had said, I am more likely to vote yes?
So she's talking about this right here.
Yes.
It's just ranked.
Just trying to
so-
understand how it all fits together.
Yeah, so just the way that we've done the charts, we put the different, so the items are read randomly to the respondents. So
To all respondents.
So
to
all
everyone.
respondents hear each message, but they're heard in random order. So, but when we show the presentation, we order them by how well they did. So so what you're seeing on the slide is not the order they were read, but they're ranked by how well they performed.
Okay, so
in this case, it's the kind of combination of the dark blue and light blue together. That's how they're ranked.
so all participants heard all questions.
With some exceptions where we wanted to, either for time reasons or to change, to see if the wording made a difference, sometimes we do this split the sample, and so that's noted as well for some of those.
For instance, the traffic circle question that we pointed out, where half the respondents heard the location of the improvements and the other half heard it described as a traffic circle. That's an example of the split sample methodology,
Okay.
where you can test additional messaging by and then compare the two sets. And there were a couple other, I think there were a couple other split samples in those.
Okay, thank you. That is helpful. And now I think I'm back to our staff. I think that you said, Director Miller, that we would expect 60 million for capital projects. I just want to make sure I had that number right.
Yeah, so all of our modeling, you know, what we really started with is trying to understand how we could stabilize our PCI scores, right? We really wanted them to go up, but even with the $60 million on top of that, bringing it forward, we just went from just slightly better, right, than where we are now, but much, much better than where we would be under Measure T. So in order to optimize taking some money off the top for capital projects and our PCI score, $60 million was sort of the magic number there.
And then the administrative increase from 1% to 2% proposed, excuse me, the bonding, let's say we accept the bonding idea, that would be done by the jurisdiction doing the project, right?
No.
Like if.
No, the agent, NVTA is the authority that NVTA-TA oversees the measure, and that would be the agency that would do the bonding. And what we would do, I mean, how it would work is we would be working with your jurisdictions to understand when they need the funds and to give them when they need them over the life. And it would bring all of it forward, right? The model basically is 4 tranches within the first 8 years.
Okay. And I did notice, and I'm just going by memory now, that the increase in construction costs, I think you did 18, 19, 19, 20, 2021, and 2021 was significantly higher.
Yeah, and that's,
And
you know,
so
that's somewhat driven.
What did we average out at as we looked at our figures?
So we used 5% as a cost escalation, right, Roxana? The numbers that we showed you of what they're doing are the actuals, but that wasn't in the model. And in the last year, I mean, we got to acknowledge what's going on is there's basically a supply chain problem, right? And that's making costs go way up right now.
Right.
For construction, yeah.
All right, thank you very much.
Yeah, sure thing.
All right. Thank you, Director Dorman. Director Joseph, Supervisor Ramos, and then Mayor Ellsworth.
Getting more to the debt service, in the modeling of what staff is proposing.
You can just, thank you, George, just so they can hear you.
Sorry. I'm trying to get a sense of how much we're looking to bond versus how much would still be a cash flow. And where I'm headed is to say, the closer we get to 100% of the proceeds are going to go towards debt service, the bigger the risk that there's an uncertainty factor, that if numbers drop.
Sure.
How do you handle the debt service is really what I'm asking.
Yeah, I mean, so the model was super conservative, and the cost that we took off the top, was it 475 million over the life of the measure, Roxana, something like that? It was almost half of the total generated. So it's close. It's in between 450. So that's pretty conservative when you think about how much money the measure would generate over a 30-year period. And so, again, we're modeling it right now. In reality, the market's going to go up and down. That's just the way it is. And as long as we have a really good rating, that stabilizes what our borrowing costs are, and just market stability, period, right? I mean, if we end up having a recession and our sales tax generations go down and costs for borrowing go up, it does change things, but we're looking over a pretty significant period of time, 30 years. And so, again, the model is very conservative, but, it's not a predictor. It's just the best information we have.
All right. Director Ramos?
Thank you for the presentation. I have a couple of questions, and I'm hoping I can draw specifically, Barry, on your experience in campaigns. What has been the trend of transportation tax measures in the Bay Area, and more specifically, looking at how RM3 did and taxes and tax initiatives thereafter?
Well, RM3, Regional Measure 3, as I'm sure you all know, did pass, and we were pleased to serve as the consultants on that project. And there have been quite a few. I mean, it's really a county by county basis. I don't believe that reached, that RM3 required 50%. I don't recall if it received 50 in Napa.
It did.
Close,
We
right?
were over,
Yeah, it was over. So,
Just two
but
counties
50% to 2/3 is quite a gap, right? So that was one of the beauties of Regional Measure 3, given that it was the bridge toll and not a sales tax, was it only required 50%. Since then, we actually just worked with Caltrain on the extension on their sales tax, which passed in November of 20 in the middle of the pandemic, and despite a lot of folks, and I will point to that as a measure where the high presidential turnout definitely was of assistance to that. So where I was talking about the difference in who votes, and in that measure in particular, San Francisco and San Mateo counties overperformed thanks to the turnout in the presidential election. Santa Clara County did fine too. Santa Clara County came in just a little bit under 2/3, but San Mateo and San Francisco were well over. In general, measures have passed, but I think that it's been there's always a tremendous amount of research and modeling and outreach prior to placement of the measures on the ballot. So there's also been strong campaigns, as there were for both of those measures, and for measures that we've done in Santa Clara County and elsewhere. But Sonoma County just passed a transportation sales tax, or extended their measure again in November of 20. I was not personally involved with that. I actually worked on the county on a mental health sales tax on the same ballot, and they both passed. And I also chalked that one up to the turnout of a presidential campaign that had paid opposition to both the transportation and the mental health sales tax, and they both passed. Both sales taxes on the same ballot in the pandemic. So, I think that a lesson learned is that outreach makes a big difference, but also to come back to the earlier point, turnout is incredibly important.
So that's a great segue into my next question, which is multi-agency or other purpose taxes on the same ballot. And what the impact is. So we've got, open space, as you know, wanting to do something. We have NVTA that we're talking about, the County of Napa looking at a fire prevention tax, and I'm missing one. Who else?
The housing, MTC. Right?
Oh, yeah, BAFA. So if that's just what we know of, and certainly, I think with many hats on, I could say every single one could be, very important at that moment, but that coordination and how does that play into the success and merit of each as we're considering assuming we say yes, when it goes.
Right. From my experience, the placement of two measures and even two sales tax measures on the same ballot is not necessarily a recipe for doom. It has happened where multiple measures on the same ballot have passed. As I just mentioned, in Sonoma County last November, in Marin County about 10 years ago, there was the SMART, the first measure that passed for SMART was on the same ballot with another tax measure. They both passed in that county. So it can happen, but I do believe that that's frequently is most likely to happen in the highest turnout. I'll also say in Napa County, as you all know, it is very, very difficult for a measure to get to 2/3. I believe Measure T might be one of the only measures, if not the only, to get over 2/3.
Measure A though too, right?
Yeah.
Measure A, so
Hotel
its
tax.
predecessor.
Right, its predecessor, yeah.
But it was significantly over too. It was almost 73% by recollection. Yeah.
So, but, there have been, Parks and Open Space has come very close twice. The college has had measures that passed at 50, got over the 55% for a bond, but didn't go over, the 2/3. Cities I know have not been able to get over 2/3. And so it's very, I don't need to tell you, it's a very challenging county for taxes. And so I think given that when there are multiple measures on, and especially if there were multiple county measures or multiple sales tax measures, that would add another level of complexity and challenge. The good news is that can all be tested, that can all be polled. My Sonoma County example, they did a poll and they tested the transportation measure and then the mental health measure, and you heard both of them in sequence, and the polling showed they were going to pass, and they both passed. So you could model that out and basically predict it based on the turnout.
And that's a great segue to my next question, which is if we're looking at, from a polling standpoint, further polling, even though Napa County's sales tax rate relative to the rest of the Bay Area, is low. I guess I would be curious in your thoughts of whether that would, if polling wise, is there a magic number out there where the populace is saying this is too much, that when we're inching up at sales tax? Because as you've said, there've been so many, we've been so close, and those of us in the room are all for, and we're saying, if we're reading this right, open space, I think, is the greatest example. If we're reading this right, it's something we value as a community. I mean, don't take it away from people, but getting people to support it makes me wonder if there is some other preconceived notion we haven't been testing in polling that we're not getting at. And I'm curious, what are your thoughts in that respect?
I want to hear John in a second. My take on it is that I don't think that people vote based on the cumulative total of their sales tax as much as on what they're facing right in that ballot question in that moment. This is going to be a quarter cent, or it's going to generate this much money, or it's going to be used for these purposes. And we see that even in counties with much higher cumulative sales taxes, where they continue to pass and bump right up against the limit. So, we believe that voters really do make a case-by-case choice. And the voters who vote in each election, that these measures do not drive turnout. I think anybody who says, well, we're going to put something on the ballot and everybody who supports transportation improvements is going to come out and vote in a otherwise low turnout, that's just not a realistic notion. Turnout's driven by a top of the ticket item like the presidency. I think that we, in constructing this poll, tried to come up with every positive as well as negative component of the measure to get a really good read on it. If over the course of time other potential ideas come up, and I'll tell you that matched a lot of what many of you were involved in the prior Parks and Open Space campaigns. The negatives are very similar, very similar sort of responses, very similar 65, 64 sort of range for the support. But the best way to know that is really just research.
I agree, and I think that it's always important to ask that question: is there something we're missing? And I think what we're seeing right now in the political environment, that there are issues that may on the surface feel sort of technocratic or sort of process oriented, but can be co-opted by sort of value judgments and feeling threatened of our way of life, or sort of these existential cultural threats. And so to the degree that we feel like a measure could be framed that way, it's important to test. I mean, one of the things that we did test was this idea that it's unfair because it taxes Napa County residents and business too much, and all those outside commuters and tourists who jam up the county's streets don't pay enough. This idea of this sort of outsider, and that's the kind of thing that we can see in other contexts gets really kind of emotionally charged. It didn't fare particularly well in this poll, but I think it's always been important to understand the underlying psychology of the electorate, depending on what else is happening as well.
All right, thank you, John. Thank you, Director Ramos. Director Ellsworth.
Thank you. Can you hear me coming through the remote?
Yes, we can.
Okay, very good. One of my questions was answered, what the percentage that Measure T passed by, I think it was 73% I heard. I also want to support Director Joseph's thought that the bonding aspect is an important aspect of this, and helping the community understand how that can be a benefit, I think, is of value. A third thought I have is there a way to look at this like hitting a single rather than a triple, in that is there a way to look at the existing Measure T, and not to say that I'm not in support of doing something in terms of a sales tax, I just in terms of looking at options, is there a way to look at the current Measure T, the redistribution aspects, the bonding aspects, and do some sort of a measure that would not necessarily seek to increase the money coming in, but just the efficiency of how we're managing the current Measure T? Is there a way to look at it that way?
Well, the presentation today was primarily just doing that. It doesn't, the figures that we were using is the existing half-cent sales tax, not an increase. It also, though, is a 30-year measure instead of a 25-year measure. So that was the big difference, that we brought the money forward and then we had an additional 5 years of revenues, but we didn't increase it in our modeling. It was still half cents.
Okay. I'm just wondering if that helps to sell it to the community. Just a thought. I'll have to think more about it too.
I mean, just in response to that, yes. Obviously, NVTA cannot use public resources for advocating for a measure, but the messaging that we used in Measure T on the campaign was that this was not a new tax, that we're adding on to the back end of Measure A, and I think that is partly why it was successful. And I would imagine, again, NVTA staff does not participate on this, but that we could have that same kind of message as part of the campaign.
Thank you.
Thank you, Director Ellsworth. We're going to go to Director Garcia, Director Canning, and then we're going to see if there's any member of the public that is not going to come back for the afternoon session. We'll try to see if we can accommodate your public comment before we break for lunch, and then we will break for lunch. So Director Garcia and then Director Canning, go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. Am I coming in okay?
Give us a second, Director Garcia. They're working on the audio real quick.
Very good.
Go ahead.
That's a lot of echo.
You're good.
Try it again. A lot of echo.
Director Garcia.
Try it again. Is that better?
Yes.
Okay, very good. Thank you. I appreciate the presentation. A lot for me to mull over. I think probably very comprehensive in that respect. I'm impressed with the polling data that we're looking at. A couple of things I'd like to share with that. The first attempt at the Jameson Canyon Highway 12 initiative went forward, failed, and the analysis when it came back was the way they put it: too many ornaments on the Christmas tree. We're promising too many things to too many people. So that was more narrowed down. It's kind of like what I think Supervisor Ramos was alluding to. It's like you have to point out the benefit of this to everyone, but you have a piece of it inside that picture. I think it worked better the second time around. It was far more refined in terms of its approach. Ultimately, with a voter base, it's the WIFM issue. What's in it for me? And I think that's how it has to be approached. This is the benefit you will realize out of this to the greater good. I think for us, the President Biden's infrastructure plans certainly are something could be attached to this passes because of, we have benefit because of, if this passes, then we have access, better access to those funding sources, hopefully. And I think I would agree, presidential races draw more voter base, and certainly had that experience where midterm is a lower turnout, sometimes pretty sad, it's around 25%, which doesn't get a lot of initiatives passed. So I think it's more of a focus also on making it more easier to understand from the voter base. A lot of us are not financial expertise. I do appreciate it, those who have it. I appreciate Vice Mayor Joseph's experience behind that. That certainly is helpful to a better understanding of it. And anybody else on this panel who can create it in terms that are more understandable by the public to vote on it. And this is the benefit if you do this. So those are my comments. Appreciate the work. Thank you.
Thank you, Director Garcia. Director Canning?
Yes, thank you. I understand, the results and to the questions and the responses, but my concern was, did you experience any confusion at the front part of this conversation or the exchange with the potential voters about there already existing the transportation tax? There's one that's there. Is this incremental? Yes, we piggybacked, I think, quite well off of Measure A expiring and this going on. I think it's a much harder message, is going to require more effort on the supporters' part of this to say, wait, this isn't incremental, it's the same, it's not costing us more, we're just kind of remaneuvering how it gets used, et cetera. That's of pretty significant concern to me.
I would just respond a little bit to that question, because when we were trying to come up with the language for the ballot measure that was being pulled for, we were strongly urged by our council that we couldn't add anything in there that this was the existing sales or existing measure, that it had to be very much couched as this is a different measure. So, and I'll let you respond to the poll.
And that was because of the bonding, because of the structural changes.
Right, and I specifically reread what you asked of them first, and immediately for me, oh, this is confusing, this is incremental, this ship has already set sail, we're already doing this. Why are you telling me this is not enough money to fix my problems, blah, blah, blah.
I mean, it's a really good question, and we do a lot of polling on ballot measures at the local and also the state level. And it's not unusual especially in the initial vote, when people don't know that much about it, for the unsure proportions to be quite large. Sometimes 15, 20%. This was striking, it was 4%. And that's not to suggest that every respondent really truly understood all the nuances of the measure, but there is enough specific information in this measure for them to get a sense one way or the other where it feels like something they should support or oppose. So yeah, all those nuances I think will be important. Those details absolutely matter. But I was struck that the proportion of unsures was not larger, because that is often the case.
So you didn't come across a tremendous amount of confusion, like, haven't we already done this recently?
No, we did not.
Okay, thank you.
Right, thank you, Director Canning. And again, we will come back after lunch to have more of a comment and discussion among the board. At this point, is there any member of the public that may not come back after the afternoon session? This will be your time. If you do come back, you won't have two opportunities. This is your one moment to provide public comment. So invite any member of the public. This is your time. And you have 3 minutes, sir.
I'm the founder and the past president of the Napa County Taxpayers Association, and I was involved in the development of Measure T when Bill Dodd and Keith Caldwell asked for community people to come together to help write a tax that would work because of the previous one that failed so badly. And we did it. And we have a good tax. Believe it or not, for the president of the Taxpayers Association to say we have a good tax, it's amazing, but it is a good tax and it's working. And so we don't want to see it go away. We don't want to see another tax. In fact, we have some questions. Are you going to stop Measure T? Are you going to delete it? Or are you going to change it into some new tax? Are you going to cancel it and then have a new tax on the ballot? These are things that are confusing to everybody. And these questions need to be answered so people can understand it. And what happens if you delete Measure T and the new tax you want fails? You're going to have no tax. I want to talk a little bit about bonding money. Bonding means borrowing. Borrowing means you bring things from the future back to now. But the problem with road repairs is they keep being needed at the same amount. So who's going to pay for the road repairs when the bonding money is already used and spent by the agency? That's a question that this community needs to answer. And I wonder, is the Napa Valley Transit Authority a good steward for tax money? Is it appropriate for an agency that is criticized for driving empty buses to pay $50 million for a bus parking lot, when that money could have been used for the Highway 12 transition there? These are questions we as taxpayers have, and we'd like to get some answers for it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Browning. All right, we've submitted those questions. This is your time if you cannot come back for the afternoon session. You have 3 minutes.
Sorry, folks, I can be here through lunch, but not this afternoon. I'm Chuck McMinn. I'm the chair and founder of the Napa Valley Vine Trail Coalition. A couple of thoughts on the changes that are being proposed. The Vine Trail can't comment on any other aspect of the proposal other than how it affects Class 1 trails. But I can say from the initial read and response that it affects it negatively right now. In Measure T, Director Miller said that the money, the 6.67% that's being put aside, is being banked. Well, it's not being banked in the same way as the money is flowing to the jurisdictions within Measure T. The 6.67% is just a list of projects that is an IOU that the districts will spend. And so there's actually no money having been spent. Well, of the total that should have been spent to date in the matching funds, it's about 4 million. Less than 2 million has actually been spent, and the rest is an IOU. That would be all right, except as we roll things forward, that IOU could be, the delay in funding Class 1 trails can mean that the amount available for Class 1 trails goes down. So that's one piece of the equation that is a little bit problematic. The second is that in the proposal, in the new proposal, there won't even be any amount of money allocated specifically for Class 1 trails. Measure T, if you take 6.67% over the life of the program, would be about $30 million for Class 1 trails in the countywide bike plan. That would be replaced in the new measure with an aggregate commitment for capital funding of $60 million for everything, with no specific amount going to Class 1 trails. So from the Vine Trails perspective, we don't think yet we can support a measure that doesn't at least fund Class 1 trails in the countywide bike plan to the tune of $30 million or more. $30 million extended for another 5 years on top of the 3 years that the measures already had would be something well in excess of 30 million. So we say, if given the choice between the current measure and a measure that in absolute reduces the amount of money for Class 1 trails and dumps it into an aggregate pot of $60 million for all capital projects, it's worse from the perspective of class one trails than what we have today, and we don't think we could recommend to our members to support it. That's not to say that if we figure out how to make whole the commitment for class one trails in the countywide bike plan, we think we could get to a position to support it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. McMinn. I don't see anyone else in person, or do we have anyone on the public line that has expressed interest in providing public comment before we break for lunch? Acknowledging we still have public comment in the afternoon, which is only 30 minutes away.
We do not.
All right, so at this point, we're going to break for lunch, and we'll come back around 12:40-ish, 12:45-ish.
Lunch is outside.
Thank you for that important disclosure. Have a good lunch.
Check, check. Check, check. Check, check. 1, 2. 1, 2, 3, 4. Select. Yeah, let's see if I can. Oh, am I muted right now? The AV, who's raising their hand? AV monitor.
Test 1, 2, 3. I can hear it coming through the speakers.
Oh no, you can unmute you. I'm trying to. Cause I'm routing it through here now for when people ask questions. Let's see here. Let me hear myself. Oh, really low. Mic check. 1, 2. Okay, there you go. This is AV monitor. Zoom Q&A test. Okay, so
Hey, Jeff. We're trying a different way for people on Zoom to talk. Would you mind just saying test 1, 2, 3, please?
Test 1, 2, 3.
Thank you. Yeah, his didn't come through.
test one more time, please.
Test 1, 2, 3. Great.
And Deanna's back.
Yeah, I heard
can-
Jeff.
You can turn yours off now. So then we'll just talk through. Okay. There you go. Okay, test one more time, please.
This is Deanne, and I heard Jeff as well.
Okay. Thank you.
And you don't want. Yeah, there's a pathway. There's a way to settle this. There's a pathway.
Mic test, 1, 2. Check. I'm in the room. Microphone. Check microphone. 1, 2, 3, 4. Check, check. Zoom mic. 1, 2. Echo check. AV monitor check. Microphone level check. 1, 2. AV monitor check. 1, 2. 1, 1. This.
Mic test 1, 2. 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 I think so. I couldn't hear you that whole time, Julian. Yeah, there's no sound coming out of that on my end.
I want to thank everyone for coming back. Those that have made it back, thank you very much. All right. So we left off with some of the directors having questions. To our board members that are attending virtually, you missed out on a great lunch. So thank you very much to the team at La Toque in the Westin. They did an incredible job of hosting us, and we're very fortunate for that. So we are now back to have a good discussion on a full stomach, which is the right formula. So I believe Director Dunbar wanted to continue with some questions, and now we can kind of have questions and discussion. This is an informational item only, but again, providing some discussion as well. Director Dunbar.
Kathy, or I mean Laura, would you go to the next slide where the questions are? So we have some questions too for some just prompt thoughts. So
Okay, no worries.
leave them up there. Okay.
Director Dunbar.
Thank you. These are kind of broader questions as it relates to the polling and the forecasting of how people will be responding. How does the federal infrastructure package play into this? It sounds like the polling was probably done before. I mean, there's not even a total conclusion of that, but in anticipation of significant federal and then also some state funding, are people likely to say, and this maybe goes a little bit to Mayor Canning's point, you already have enough resources coming your way. Why are you looking at this? Did you factor that into?
No, so that was not factored into this poll because it was done, it was in May of last year, quite a bit before. I'll say though, from experience elsewhere and on other projects, that the vast majority of voters as a whole are not as up to speed on federal, state, additional funding, what it means at the local community. You know, it's I would put somewhere between 5 and 10% who are actually tracking to that level of detail and making those connections when they decide how to vote on. And that does go to Mr. Canning's question earlier, you know, about their recollection of the last measure. So really what we try to do is gauge the response to the ballot question that they see in front of them. And but those are important factors in terms of attention that the measure receives, or questions from stakeholders or others who are, in the mix and wanting to know how this is affected by that other funding. So I guess the short answer is it is important, but perhaps more important with the stakeholders than with the mass of the voters.
Two other questions. One, it relates to the 6.67% Class 1 funding that currently exists and whether it will continue or not. We've seen a significant, I would say, significant evolution of outdoor recreational activity in the last year and a half, related largely to the pandemic.
Right.
People seem to have really embraced, whether it's bicycling or just outdoor recreation in all forms and fashion. How do we factor that kind of new behavior pattern into the value of the dedicated Class 1 funding percentages that we currently have?
Well, I can only speak to the research side of it, which is that, we did see the positive responses toward projects that supported, bike lanes and bicycle lane. And, in terms of the policy side of it and the allocations, I'll leave that to others on the policy side, but I can confirm for you that there certainly the numbers for the bicycling piece of it were strong, and I have not seen parks and open space numbers in this county in the last during the pandemic, but I'll say in other counties where we've polled, it's been extremely strong for trails and hiking and biking and that kind of thing. So there's definitely been an upswing of support there. For those types of measures, and I would expect we'd see a similar translation of that support here.
Then last question relates to state voter threshold. I know that our Assembly Member Aguilar Curry has been leading that effort. How would that change the dynamics if it goes from a 2/3 to a 55% threshold? It looks like the numbers you're saying would exceed that significantly, but how might that affect? We're trying to make decisions now with that
that legislation in process.
Right. Well, it's a great question. I believe that would require a state vote, similar to Prop 39, which dropped the school bond requirement to 55%. So I believe that would, I'm not expert on that bill, but if that went through, if her legislation went through, it would then be voted on by the voters in November of 22. So you could then have that opportunity in November of 24, which could be a very sweet spot because you'd be combining the higher turnout with a lower threshold. If you were to wait until November of 24. I'll say I am a very strong rooter for that measure, as well as anything that drops the threshold for local communities to be able to pass taxes. Unfortunately, over the years, there's been many attempts to drop it for transportation, for school parcel taxes, for sales taxes, for housing. And unfortunately, it hasn't been able to get there yet in the legislature, but I sure hope that your assembly member can get it through and the voters would pass it. And but I think that would be a huge advantage if you were to choose to go in 24 and that rule was changed.
Yeah, I just wanted to highlight that because it is probably a total game changer in terms of the timing of it. We're talking about 2024, if that does get through.
Right. The one challenge is it would have to pass in November of 22. And as we're saying, the turnout in November 22 statewide, as well as locally, will be much smaller and more conservative than it would be in 24. So it would not be a given. I mean, Prop 39 passed, it had tremendous support from both the school community as well as builders and construction companies. There were a lot of folks in favor of that. I'm sure our friends at the Alliance for Jobs and others would be very strong supporters of dropping the transportation threshold to 55%. But that would not be a slam dunk to pass that statewide.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor. Director Dunbar. What I'll share is, I don't have a lot of questions on the technical stuff. The data is pretty clear. The universe of who was surveyed is strong. 507 is a respectable number. So I think the conclusion, at least that I see, 2024 is where this should be happening. That's the discussion. That's the timing of when we should have that discussion based off the data. That's what the data is telling me individually. I guess where, my challenge is, I think our municipalities are doing a great job with the dollars you're getting, whether it's funded through general fund or taxing. I think we're putting money where it needs to go. And I commend, the town of Yountville for their success in terms of paving roads. We're all trying to do as much as we can, but I see this as an opportunity to shift away from the norm, which is you keep investing in the same thing you're investing in. And I think we have an opportunity to challenge ourselves, to get a little uncomfortable. And the easy thing would be to go return to source. And Kate and staff did an incredible job of trying to keep everyone happy. But I think the opportunity here is to acknowledge that for us to deliver these projects that are quality of life for our community, we're not going to be able to have funding come together. It's going to take years and years to get the aggregate of the funding to deliver some of these projects. Sosco Junction is a great example. We've been at it, how many years, Kate?
Over 15.
Over 15 years to deliver a project that's so critical to our community. The roundabouts that we're trying to do up Valley, we're leveraging outside funding for that. I think this is an opportunity to look at not just roads, but those capital projects that are wrapped around quality of life for our community. And that may mean us getting a little uncomfortable with return to source and identifying a percent off the top that goes into projects. I'm really interested in, what the pandemic has taught us, not just the Vine Trail, but safe routes to school and those quality of life things that I think we need to do a better job of, that our residents are very vested in doing. And if we let this opportunity pass, it's not going to be in our collective lifetimes where we see another signature project happen. And this is our opportunity to create funding that allows us to deliver those projects, to leverage outside money, to deliver the airport roundabouts, to deliver some of these significant, very expensive, but also value-driven projects for our community. So I support this conversation. I look forward to having it done in 2024. But the direction I would like us to explore is breaking away from the return source just to roads and look at projects that we discussed, that there's collective support on. I know American Canyon, you have a great plan that we need to fund. And the operative word is we. And there's some projects on Silverado Trail, and there's some projects in every municipality that if you go at it by yourself, it's going to take years and years. So I guess that's the only comment I would make at this time about the direction in the future, and just not missing this opportunity to think a little bit more regionally. And I know that's hard for us because we all want to keep score for our municipalities, but I think we're at a point now where our individual projects have regional benefits. So no questions, just more comments at this time. All right, I'll keep looking around the room. If there's any director, Director Joseph, I'm going to go to Vice Chair Alessio and then second round. Vice Chair Alessio.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you again for the presentation and all the work and preparation it took, and thank you, staff, for making today go so smoothly. Boy, there's a lot of takeaways, and there's already been a lot of great questions, and I thank everybody for those questions. In terms of what Chair Pedrosa just said, our communities really do want us to work together. They want us to leverage the expertise and the resources to come to a combined solution and really make these challenges regarding our road safety, the congestion that we see, the bike lanes. I think that's a really important element that we want to highlight. That we know it's a need, we know the community wants it. As presented to us when you mentioned safe routes to schools, there'll be more children out there cycling because parents will feel comfortable and feel like they're safe to cycle, and more adults who may be commuting via bicycle, if we do invest more in the Class 1 bike lanes. So I think there's a lot of opportunity here. I really hope the legislation passes that Assembly Member Cecilia Aguirre Curry is attempting. I think it'll benefit this in the future, along with other really important measures that really protect and preserve and enhance as we talk about the health, safety, and quality of life for the people that we serve in our communities. But going back, I can just tell you that residents who live here, they really want us. It's not about us and them; it's about we, as you said, and they've been wanting those silos to fall down and disappear, and let's just all kind of come to the same watering hole together and work together. And I thank everybody on this board, because I think that's what our goal is to do this. Looking at these different opportunities, there's a lot of great opportunities. I think timing is really important, and I'll end it with this. The poll being taken in May, I think it would be very helpful to have another poll. I would definitely support another poll to see how this stands a little later on, beyond the pandemic, beyond to see what the federal infrastructure, if that's passed, and see how that's going to impact it too. So I guess we'll learn more later, but thank you.
Thank you, Vice Chair. Director Joseph.
That I like today's retreat. And for me, I think the big issues center around the bonding as well as the leveraging. In a nutshell, Measure T is currently construed, forces you to basically save up your dollars until you can do it. And I think that could be a great sales pitch, is to argue that in effect, we could get almost twice the amount of value if we allow for bonding than if we left it as is. And so that becomes that rationale, because I think Mayor Canning is right. Most people are going to say, well, I thought we already have this. And so you've got to make a distinction. And to me, the distinction is that bonding capacity. And so if we're going to do some more polling, I think we should focus on how that resonates. And people can say, well, I don't like having debt because I have 20 years or 30 years of debt, and how do I know I can pay it and all that? So you've got to balance the value of bonding with the downside. But bonding to me is the key issue. We may even want to explore beefing up that $60 million capital budget, because I do think being able to sell the public on this is going to fix congestion is a much stronger argument than the value of time, the time value of money, which is important to me, but might be confusing to others. So I think for me, the focus is on bonding. If we can offer a certainties that the Vine Trail is going to be financed, along with some of the improvements in 29 that will reduce congestion, these become very tangible things to sell, whereas it isn't the case under Measure T. And then leveraging, of course, we've all talked about, and that kind of depends. If Build Back Better gets approved, obviously we'll be able to do stuff with that we otherwise couldn't, but time will tell there. So I think a little more polling would be appropriate. I think 2024 is the right year. I certainly wouldn't support trying to bump the tax up from the 0.5%. And frankly, the closer we leave it to the current allocations, the better, or at least to the current monies that you're going to get. For example, if we did take more off and that our share might be less, but because we're getting it up front instead of over 30 years, if American Canyon ends up with the same 20 million bucks or whatever for road maintenance that we were going to get either way, it's hard to get too indignant, especially if there's some earmarked monies for the Vine Trail or parallel roads and so on. So I think there's hope. It's tight right now, but I think there's hope.
All right, thank you, Director Joseph, Director Dunbar, and then I see Director Garcia as well. Director Dunbar.
And I wholeheartedly agree with the unified effort being critical, because we each have our own kind of micro concerns, but really on the macro level, these kind of projects, I would dare I say, you never have all the money up front. And so I think Director Joseph makes a very valid point about the value of debt service. We're paying our community center in Yountville 30 years on debt service. We would not have that facility today if we had tried to wait until we had all the money up front. By the way, that's all being paid by visitor hotel tax, so that works out really well for us. What I do want to highlight, though, is some jurisdictions have invested in infrastructure, roads, streets, more than other jurisdictions. And I want to just be careful that as we are looking at the allocations going forward, that those that have proactively funded, and yes, of course, I'm talking about Yountville specifically, but not only, we have the highest level for a reason. We have invested significantly in our streets and roads. We've had the ability to do that. We also were the #1 most impacted city, town in the entire state of California and lost revenue since the pandemic. So it's not an automatic decision for us, but I think the key is to recognize and respect the investments that some of us, our jurisdictions, have made, and so that it's not just going to those who have not been able to prioritize and therefore have other things that need to happen to elevate. I'm trying to be very sensitive to the fact that all of these investments have significant budget impacts, and we all have in some cases, different levels of priority that we've established. So I just want to make sure that we are recognizing that, and we're not losing value for having proactively maintained at a higher level. And then it's like, well, we're never going to see any of the funding support because we have a high pavement index, or we don't have as much traffic congestion. So that's just something to be aware of as we go forward.
Well, and to that point, the working group acknowledged that in some respects, a straight need, which would actually optimize the PCI scores for the whole valley, was rewarding some jurisdictions for not investing as much into their infrastructure as others. And so I think there was general acknowledgement of that. It's also the maintenance of effort that jurisdictions are currently, paying they're having to commit to, which is right now an average of 2008 to 2010, investments is also all over the board. So we did not go into and delve into the maintenance of effort requirement in the measure, but it's probably worth revisiting at some point to discuss that. And again, I think this working group was really pretty forthright and honest, although some of them, fought harder for their jurisdictions. But I think there was like a very healthy conversation about some of these things.
Director Garcia and then Director Ellsworth.
Yes, thank you. I think the bonding effort makes sense. I think it's a matter of how that's explained to the voting population. Clearly, the data we saw today is a good takeaway to compare that. As time goes on, construction projects gets more expensive. We have less funding. Things take longer to get done, and some things will fall off the to-do list as a result of funding. So I think a way of explaining it, this is how we go forward with it. Maybe if you, I don't know, help me with an analogy here. You don't buy a house with all the cash up front. None of us have that. So we go to a mortgage company and we're paying them interest on the money we're borrowing. I mean, that kind of relates to a way that might be able to explain that. To say, okay, we can have that. You can have the house now, but you're going to be paying it over time. You can have the money up front for bonding for streets improvements, highway improvement, and you're paying it over time. That makes sense. Other than that, I don't see that decline in it. It's going to be things. The biggest complaint now I hear often is, when are you going to get this thing done? It's the old whiffing. What's in it for me? How am I going to get this thing done? Well, actually, this is bigger than just what's in it for me. This is what's in it for all of us, because streets and highways are the things that's going to improve quality of life, the economy for all of us. And I'm pleased to see that hopefully there might be some leveraging, certainly with the infrastructure plans that President Biden has, and the state being maybe a part of that. And I think it'll benefit all of us.
Thank you, Director Garcia. Director Ellsworth.
Thank you. I'll reiterate that the bonding, I think, is critical. I think as Mayor Garcia or Director Garcia points out, folks don't buy their homes generally with cash. There's a mortgage involved. There's a healthy amount of debt that I think that we can look at. There's a balance. And so I think that that's a very important aspect to look at. The idea of regional, I think, is very, very important. Measure T, because we all worked on it together and supported it together, has created funding sources that are allowing St. Helena to turn things in the right direction. So I believe we have sort of turned in a good direction. We're not everywhere we need to be, but we're moving in that direction. Want to make sure, though, that we look at the return to source in terms of how we look at the balances. I don't know where every city or jurisdiction is in terms of how much they're putting in as opposed to return to source. But I do believe there are some decisions made locally in terms of our streets and roads where a certain amount of control, et cetera, we need the funding sort of in the towns to help direct it specifically to the areas we need the most attention on. I think the people of St. Helena, the community, supports the regional aspect. We all know what this traffic is like and that it doesn't start or stop at our borders. That hybrid solution, I think, is important. I'm wondering if there's a way to look at putting part of it forward in 2022 and part of it forward in 2024, just in terms of the formulas, et cetera. I wonder if there's a way to look at that sooner rather than later, et cetera.
All right, thank you, Director Ellsworth.
Well, I would just reemphasize that any changes to the existing measure would need to go to the voters, and it cost well, and I just leave it at that.
All right.
Yeah.
Director Canning.
Thank you. I certainly understand and appreciate the bonding importance. We have a similar situation with projects we do. My only concern is, having been educated by a public works director in my own community, the minute you build or repave a new road, from minute one, it already starts to deteriorate. So my concern is, if we borrow too much too far ahead, when we get to that time point, what's going to pay for that rebuilding? So we need to be very concerned and careful about that. Yes, we all live in the same county. Yes, we all at some point share the same roads. At the end of the day, the population bases live in the cities, and in the cities, all we hear about is the pothole on their street in front of their house. If we shy away, and I'm saying this from an informed position when we were encouraging, supporting, pushing Measure T through, the return to source was a significant concern in our community. And if we do anything to modify return to source in a significant way, it's going to be a much harder push or pull, at least in my jurisdiction, and I believe similar to some of my colleagues in the cities, and that can be a concern when this has to carry a significant number across the board. And then on the maintenance of effort side of the fence, I would love to see that revisited, because I don't think it is being reviewed or applied in all jurisdictions the same way. And I just go back and cite the multiple conversations that we had to have as a board on what was supposed to be a pretty formulaic process. Thank you.
Thank you, Director Canning. All right, don't see any other directors in person or virtually. Let's see if there's any members of the public. If this is your time to address us, you have 3 minutes.
Very much, Chair, and members of the board. Philip Sales, Executive Director of the Napa Valley Vine Trail Coalition. Chuck McMinn spoke a little bit earlier, and I've just got a little bit more information I'd like to put out there. Our organization was founded in 2009 before Measure T, and our organization supported Measure T primarily because it would provide a source of funding for Class 1 bike paths. In 2012, the county bike plan that was adopted had about 42 miles of Class 1 included, and the consultants at that time estimated the cost per mile was about $550,000. The popularity of the Class 1 trails, particularly the Vine Trail, by the time the 2020 plan came along, there's now 120 miles of Class 1 in the plan, and the cost per mile is $1.17 million. So you've got 3 times as many miles in the plan at twice the cost. So already that 6.67% is looking pretty puny in terms of addressing those needs. It's probably not going to be sufficient. The use on the Vine Trail, I'm just going to put this out because I heard the executive director talking about different types of modes. We know that from going out and doing surveys out on the Vine Trail that 10 times as many people use the Vine Trail than use Solano Avenue. Now, Solano Avenue is not a great road. It doesn't have a great shoulder. So last year when we were preparing for a grant application, we set up a counter up near Oakville where there's a very wide shoulder, plenty of room for cyclists, and obviously that would be great for somebody who's a skilled cyclist. 8 times as many people were using the Vine Trail, not more than a couple of miles away down in Yountville, than we're using that shoulder. So we know that when you build these Class 1 facilities, they do get a lot of use. And last year, and I think you've heard this statistic from me before, we had 523,000 people using the Vine Trail, which was a 46% increase over the prior year. And these aren't guesses. These are actually 24/7 real-time counts, because we have 3 bike counters collecting all this data all the time. So there is a huge amount of support for these type of facilities. Our concern is that if you are not going to do something that is not a set aside for bike paths and you just lump us in with all the other capital projects, it will never rise to the level of getting the funding. So our concern is that if you're going to do something, we need to see a percentage put aside. We need to have it written into it, unlike the situation right now, which Chuck mentioned earlier, which is sort of this IOU approach. We want to see a way that these funds get used and applied. And finally, a particular issue of mine that I want to really stress is that most of the public works departments right now do not include on their pavement management programs the Class 1 bike paths. And we feel that is really important, because that's just a ticking time bomb. Sooner or later, those bike paths will start to unravel. And if we haven't built into our planning the ability to reseal and repave those paths, that's a huge piece of infrastructure that's going to fall apart. And then you're scrambling, trying to find grant money to replace it all. So we're going to be tracking this very carefully. We haven't obviously talked to our board yet, but we will be bringing it to them at some point. I'd like to feel that we could support it in those terms. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Sells.
Good afternoon, Patrick Band, Executive Director, Napa County Bicycle Coalition. I want to thank everybody for the conversations today, particularly Chair Pedroza for his comments and Vice Chair Alessio for their comments about safe routes to schools and the importance of providing safe opportunities for kids to walk and bike to school. This is a unique opportunity to look at not just how is Measure T right now not meeting the needs of our community, but what are the opportunities we have over the next 2 years as we look towards 2024 to make some pretty significant changes to make sure that a future Measure X is meeting all the needs of our communities. Is it just about paving streets and having smoother roads, or is it about making those streets safer for everybody so that kids and adults can walk and bike safely? As you saw in the polling data, Safe Routes to Schools programs was the second highest polling question when it came to priorities for our community. That kind of information was supported by a recent poll that we conducted with EMC Research, which found, and I'm just going to get the numbers here, 93% of parents surveyed, over 450 parents throughout Napa County, wanted their kids to be able to walk and bike safely to school. Yet 96% had significant concerns about speeding cars and distracted drivers. We have to have better facilities, safer facilities for kids to get to and from school. Today, in our adopted countywide bike plan, we have over 550 miles of planned but unbuilt bicycle facilities. That's Class 1 separated paths like the Vine Trail, but also important Class 2 and Class 3 and even some Class 4 protected on-street facilities that are becoming more and more common. Getting that stuff built is going to take some significant time. And as our partners in the city of Napa know, we looked at how the city of Napa alone has done in building out our bike network. And we found that based on the last 5 years of construction, it would take somewhere around 90 years to complete just the city of Napa's planned bicycle network. Simply put, that's unacceptable. We have to think more deeply about how we're going to accelerate the build out of a safe, accessible network for people to get to and from not just school, but work and other destinations for visitors and residents of all ages. So again, we have this really unique opportunity. And what we're asking is for the NVTA-TA board to look at some more comprehensive changes to Measure T so that we can include active transportation as a core component of any measure that might go to the ballot in 2024. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Band.
Hi, thank you. I'm Anna Shuto. I'm actually an alternate member, and I shared my comments with our Vice Mayor Doreen, and he encouraged me to show up today, so I wanted to share it with all of you. I went with the Napa Bike Coalition and a few other elected officials down to Berkeley to look at the bike infrastructure and what they're doing there. And we were able to learn, after we experienced how it really can feel safer to be on the streets, there's so many new things that are happening that you can put in more quickly than some of the long-term and really expensive infrastructure, and it really makes a difference when you feel safe biking. And Supervisor Wagconnect and Councilmember Mary Loros, we all got to experience it with a bunch of staff. These new changes, and we learned that the way that they're able to do it in Alameda County is there is some designated funding, and they have a funding pot. And one of the ideas was that what if we had this funding, if you set aside 15% actually that could go to these new projects. And the idea is to take away the red tape to actually allow our cities to be able to do more and do it quickly, which is what they saw happen during the pandemic. So I just wanted to share that idea. I see this Measure X as an opportunity to look at that. I also think 2024 is too far away. So can we look at projects that we can do now with the goal of getting more people out of their cars to reduce the greenhouse gases and also congestion, and make it more immediate that people are getting on bikes and they're walking, and us in our local jurisdictions, we can actually afford to do these projects. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Shuto. Do we have anyone else? I see no one else. Oh, Dorothy, come on up.
Dorothy Glaros. I'm Secretary of the Napa County Taxpayers Association, lifelong Napa resident, and heavily invested in our nonprofits in our community. The question of the 30-year Measure X, does that start anew with the passage of Measure X, or does it just tag on another 5 years to the existing T? And in answering Leon Roning's question, what happens if Measure X doesn't pass? It's pretty simple. All you do is put wording into Measure X. It says, if Measure X does not pass, Measure T is still in existence. I have 3 questions and comments. And before I do this, I want to thank everybody in this room for your dedication to our community and everything you do. Thank you for the lovely lunch. It was very, very nice. Concerning bonding, I get it. You want more money today so you can do the projects. But I want to know how much interest we're going to pay on that. But of course, the crystal ball, I've left it at home, and I know you can't answer that anyway. But that's something the taxpayers are going to want to know. I personally want my taxes to pay for what it's supposed to pay for, which is the roads. I don't want it to pay for interest on future spending. My father, who went through the Depression, said, hey, if you don't have the money today, wait until you do. I know a lot of people feel that way, not just me. So most people will say, I want the most bang for my buck. If you're going to tax people for roads, spend it on roads, don't spend it on interest. What happens when you've used up all of that money later down in the 30 years? What are you going to do then? It's going to get more expensive then anyway. And so people are going to say, well, why aren't you fixing this? We gave you 30 years. So that's something I think you need to think about. Are you going to think about asking for another tax because your money ran out because you'd already used it all? The second thing is, when you talk about the roundabouts, I would not use that as a big selling point, because those of us who have to go through the roundabouts, yes, it does move traffic along, but I'll tell you, I have taken my breath away occasionally when people take away the right-of-way, and it's almost caused accidents. So I'd be careful about that, putting that out as a point. And before I bring up my third point, please, to the people behind me, don't kill the messenger. But I do get around a lot. On page 25, direct quote, top chart, the plan renews our commitment towards walking and biking as a solution to traffic congestion, greenhouse gas emissions, improving health. So my question is, how does that actually do that? They're great buzzwords, but you need to be specific. You need to separate necessary transportation from recreation. Those are 2 big different things. The Vine Trail is a beautiful trail, but can you really say that the people who ride up valley are reducing transportation costs and greenhouse emissions? They're recreating, and that's okay, but you need to be specific.
Ms. Galeros, your 3 minutes are up, so if you can just finish your final comment, please.
Okay, my final comment is, are people who drive to work in congestion, or tourists who drive our roads, residents who have to leave their homes for appointments, shopping, etc., are they going to say that creating a new bike path has a higher value than their transportation needs?
Thank you very much, Ms.
Please
Galeros.
take that in consideration. Thank you so much for your time.
All right. I don't see anyone else in person. Laura, do we have anyone virtually? Okay, I'll bring it back to the board. Director Miller, did you have any questions?
Well, if we were going to conclude today, I just wanted to acknowledge specific staff.
Before we do that,
Okay.
Any questions that you heard during public comment from the beginning or this
Yeah,
afternoon?
sure.
Just to
Well,
address those real quick.
Please. So the idea would be that if the board approved us to go out again for another sales tax measure, is to replace Measure T. But we would include language that would allow Measure T to survive if a Measure X did not pass. So I think that answers your questions, and it would be 30 years if we were going to do a new one.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Director Miller. So I'll bring Director Joseph.
One quick comment, because it's been brought up a few times. The idea that after you spent the money, there's nothing for the maintenance. And I think we may need a little bit of a refresher course on the whole pavement management system and how when you rebuild a road, you can maintain it a lot cheaper on an ongoing basis than if you just wait until it turns to gravel. So I think that concern can be addressed as well.
Yeah, I think some of the things that's driving our PCI scores right now is just the immense amount of deferred maintenance in the condition of our current roads. And you nailed it, exactly what it is, that if we are able to do some huge investments at the beginning, the cost of maintenance over time is much less. And so it saves the taxpayers money that way as well.
Thank you, Director. And I just want to highlight a comment that I think Director Canning made, which is very appropriate, of what we hear about our residents and the potholes. You know, that's never going to go away. It's always going to be there. But what I look at is the opportunity cost of those residents that are also sitting in traffic, whether it's getting to work or going to take their kids off, drop off, or soccer practice. That issue is always relevant as well. The problem is the ownership of that. That's the regional ownership that we have, and that's the problem we're trying to solve. So I don't want to take away from that criticalness of the statement that Director Canning made, because it's so appropriate, but at a certain point, that traffic issue, it's going to rise to the top, and there's that opportunity cost. And this is a moment where you could actually make meaningful change on traffic, because we all share that responsibility. And again, that's the uncomfortable conversation that we just have to have at the right time. And I think we need to find a way to balance it, because yes, we absolutely need to take care of our roads. But when you look at the traffic, and we all know it, some of you might get it, or not now, but if you came in the morning or afternoon, you get those peaks. And that's the cost I see in our community. That's not going to go away. It's only going to get worse, especially when you layer it with some of the climate challenges and objectives that I think are coming down our way. So at that point, any final comments, Director Dunbar?
Yeah, I wanted to touch on some of the questions that were posed for us to consider. I would not consider eliminating the 6.67%. I wouldn't. I see, as the point I made earlier, we have seen a dramatic increase in outdoor activity, recreational activity. I get that that's specific to Class 1 paths, but that allows us to dedicate other budget funds to other transportation modes and quality maintenance, things like that. I would absolutely support looking at a bond capability with this new measure, because as several of us have pointed out, our jurisdictions use debt service in a very effective way on a very regular basis. I get this is in some cases a generational thing, that if you don't have it, don't spend it. Anybody not have a credit card in their pocket right now? That's what we do, frankly. And with these major projects, I think, Chair, you were the one that mentioned it. We're never going to see any major capital project if we're waiting until it's fully funded. But I do think that identifying the fact that maintenance does need to be a part of this. We saw that in the early stages of the Vine Trail, when we were all very focused on getting miles built, and then the realization of what about year 2, year 3, year 4. So I think we definitely have to have that as part of the consideration. I would not try to make this thing happen in 2022 at all. I think it would absolutely fail. We already have funding coming in with Measure T. It's not like we have to wait until 2024 to fund projects. But if this was brought forward, given all the current conditions and the fact that people are going to say, what about Measure T? What about the federal infrastructure money that we're going to get some of that money, whether it's going to be 2 trillion or 1 trillion or whatever that is, we already have new funding sources. So I think that 2024, do this right, let the public give as much input as they want, and let us review it for at least the next year and a half to get it right, like we did with Measure T, get all the stakeholders involved, to try to push this forward in 2022, given especially the professional analysis we've heard today, I think would be a terrible idea.
All right, thank you, Director Dunbar. Director Sedgley.
Thank you. And I'll agree with Director Dunbar on that point on timing. Timing is everything. And thinking back and looking, how how we look at things and prepare for the future. I serve on Napa Sanitation, and the future of sanitation is amazing, and where we need to go. And in the past few years in transportation, we've talked a lot about that. What is the future? Greenhouse gases. What are we going to drive? How are we going to get there? Ride sharing, all those things. Because I know the population growth has in California has dictated how we do things. But as a child, I watched Interstate 80 going, from the Bay Area over the Summit, and Highway 40 went from 2 lanes to 4 lanes, and it needs to go to 4 lanes to 6 lanes. And in a lot of places now we're at 8 lanes. I was a child when the Southern Crossing was built, the Butler Bridge. When 29, there was no 221, 29 just came up, and it was gridlock. The solution was this bridge over the river, the Southern Crossing. But it was temporary. It seemed like everything, we're always chasing our tail on solving these transportation issues. Look at the longevity of BART. What an amazing concept BART was when we took on BART to really make a difference. It was this phenomenal change, but then we just stopped on BART somewhat. But so just, for the board, take that into consideration on where we're going in the future, and it's just building wider, taller, more might not always be the best solution. The Vine Trail is an amazing thing. I agree with lots of what's said on the Vine Trail on maintaining, completing, and using that mode of transportation. It's not for everybody. Ms. Galargos brings up a good point on recreation versus need. Those are important things for our senior population too, and that's why public transportation is so important to me. But return to source is important to me. I mean, when we tax our residents on everything, every item they purchase, it's important that it comes back primarily there. Not to say we can't do things regionally, but that's a huge issue with me is where that tax money is generated. It's been a great meeting.
You can always count on Director Sedgley to be the historian of the group, but great history. It's good to know. And I will say this too, on BART, we can all praise it now, but when it was first starting, there was a lot of criticism of BART, of why they were doing this. And you look at it now, and I think that's what we're all trying to grapple with, is how do we take care of the needs today, but also be a little futuristic about where our community's going. So any final comments, questions? Vice Chair Leslie will close us out.
Just real quick. Yeah, everybody can hear me. Okay, great. Just really quick, and thank you, Mayor Sedgley. You said everything so well. I just love what you say and how you say it. A couple just takeaways that I've heard and that I agree with, and that is further polling is needed. That election 2024 really does make the most sense. And that we need to really highlight the cost benefit distinction between Measure T and Measure X, so the voters know what are they going to benefit from this, and why should they go out there and risk and say yes on another measure, and having the understanding of the bond, and the benefits of a bond, and the return that will give, and financial return, because that makes complete sense. But being able to educate people on that, I think is going to be really important. And something that was identified again on this survey, which I think is so true, and we always want to remember, and that is, we want to use the funds efficiently as promised and be accountable for those in a very transparent way. Thank you.
All right. I think we've provided plenty direction, Director Miller. Anything that you want to close out, highlight?
I just want to make sure that everybody is aware of the hard work that staff did leading up to this day. And I wanted to call out Roxana Marati. Roxana, if you could just wave, who was our whiz on the financial model. And then Alberto Esqueda, who could not be here today, and Sanjay Mishra, who are our street saver nerds. And then our newest staff member, Victoria Ortiz, who is not only a brilliant planner and going to be very useful, she also is helpful with the graphics, because our PIO, unfortunately, is out on leave right now. And then I also wanted to acknowledge Laura and Kathy, who pulled today's offsite meeting together under some difficult circumstances. So I just wanted to acknowledge them as well. And then last but not least is thank you for your input today, and you're willing to participate on some arduous and sort of, nerdy stuff that trying to get your head around it and being real advocates for the NVTA as board members. So I appreciate that very much.
Thank you, Director Miller, and also to all the Public Works directors that are here. Thank you for participating. This is what makes communities special, when it's the elected bodies with the career staff working for one goal. So that was definitely demonstrated today. Kate, thank you for leading this effort and making this happen. To the staff of the Weston, I'm still full from that great lunch. And then lastly to the board, really appreciate every single one of you being willing to provide good input and being prepared for the discussion. Definitely showed today. So we've been provided direction. So let's move on to any future agenda items. Seeing none. With that, we will. Oh, yes, Director Canning.
I don't know where we would fall this in, but I'd like staff to start, renew a conversation for the Up Valley for transit extension or some sort of transit solution or assistance for servicing. And somebody's going to groan when I say this, but the St. Helena Hospital situation. And I know I was on a commission or a board or a committee years ago about this, but I'd like to have it revisited because since COVID and appointments coming back into play, it's becoming a bigger issue, specifically in a little bit of Yountville, but mostly St. Helena and Calistoga communities for access to medical appointments and the such.
All right, thank you, Director Canning. Director Ellsworth.
Thank you. I'd like to reiterate that as well and support Mayor or Director Canning's comments. The hospital is an absolute asset up Valley and really to the whole Valley and County. So renewing that conversation, I think, is very important to this whole up Valley community, and certainly that extends throughout the whole county. So just want to reiterate that.
All right, thank you, Director Ellsworth. Seeing no other future agenda items, we're going to adjourn to our next meeting, October 20th. Meeting adjourned. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all. No, it's more appropriate in the NVTA-TA, but we'll add it.